Clara Whitmore stepped down from the stagecoach, set her small suitcase in the dust, and slapped the man who reached to touch her without asking. The crack of her palm echoed across the whole street. Every head turned, every mouth fell open. A woman like her, round-faced, heavy alone, was supposed to shrink, was supposed to beg, was supposed to be grateful for any hand that came near. Instead, she looked the man dead in the eye and said, "You don't put your hands on a woman you haven't earned the right to touch." And in that moment, everyone in that Montana town knew Ethan Walker's mail-order bride was not the woman they'd expected. Before we go on, I want to ask you something. If a story like this means something to you, subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. And leave a comment telling me the name of the city where you're watching from right now so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The man who'd been slapped was named Dale Preston, and he was the kind of man who'd never been told no by anyone smaller than a horse. He stood there with his hand on his cheek and his mouth working like a fish pulled out of water. "You," he sputtered. "You crazy heifer." "That's twice now you've spoken to me like I'm livestock," Clara said, and she picked her suitcase back up off the ground. "There won't be a third." Somebody in the crowd laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the kind of laugh that a whole town gives when it's decided how it feels about a stranger before the stranger has even set down her bag. "Big words," a woman called out from the boardwalk. She had a parasol and a fine dress and the sort of face that had never worried about a meal in its life. Big words from a big girl. More laughter. Clara turned toward the sound of it slowly, and she found the woman with the parasol, and she held her gaze until the laughter died down on its own. "You'll forgive me, ma'am," Clara said. "I've traveled 11 days by rail and coach to get to this town. I'm tired, I'm hungry, and I've been insulted twice before I found the shade, so I'll ask you plain which one of you is Ethan Walker." Nobody answered. The wind moved down the street and rattled a loose shutter somewhere. A dog barked and thought better of it, and still nobody answered. "I wrote to a man named Ethan Walker," Clara said louder now. "He answered me. He sent me the fare. He told me to meet him here on the 14th of June at the stage stop. Today is the 14th. I am here. Now which of you is him?" A boy of maybe 12 sitting on a rain barrel finally spoke up. "He ain't come to town, miss." "He hasn't come to town," Clara repeated. "No, miss. Mr. Walker don't come to town much no more. Not since—" The boy stopped himself and looked around like he'd said something he wasn't supposed to. "Not since what?" But the boy just shook his head and looked at his boots. The woman with the parasol laughed again, softer this time, meaner. "He sent for you and didn't even bother to come collect you. That ought to tell you something, sweetheart. That ought to tell you exactly what you've gotten yourself into." Clara set her jaw. She had come too far and given up too much to let a woman with a parasol send her running back east. "It tells me," Clara said, "that the man is busy, which is more than I can say for the lot of you." And she picked up her suitcase and started walking, though she had no earthly idea which direction the Walker Ranch lay. She made it about 40 feet before a voice stopped her. "You'll want the North Road, ma'am." She turned. An old man was sitting outside the mercantile whittling something small out of a piece of pine. He didn't look up when he spoke. "Black Hollow's about 9 miles north," the old man said. "Up in the high country. It's a hard walk, longer if you don't know the turns." "Then I thank you for the direction," Clara said. The old man's knife kept moving. Shavings curled off the pine and fell into his lap. "That ranch is a graveyard, ma'am. Just so you know it before you go. Ethan Walker buried his wife up there 4 years back, and he's been burying himself ever since. Ain't nothing left on that land but a broken man and broken fences." Clara stood there a long moment. "Then I reckon he needs the company," she said, and she started up the North Road. The old man finally looked up. He watched the round-faced woman in the faded blue dress walk toward the mountains with her chin high and her suitcase swinging, and he shook his head and he said quiet to nobody, "Lord help her." The walk took Clara the better part of 4 hours. The road climbed and climbed. Her feet blistered inside her boots. Her dress stuck to her back. But she did not stop, and she did not cry, and she did not once think about turning around, because turning around meant going back to a place where she had been nobody's wife, and nobody's hope, and nobody's anything at all. She came over the last rise as the sun was starting to lean toward the west, and she saw the ranch for the first time. It was worse than she'd been told. The main house sagged on its foundation like a man too tired to stand straight. Half the corral fence lay flat in the weeds. The barn door hung on a single hinge and swung a little in the wind, groaning. There were cattle scattered across the near pasture, but they were thin ribby things standing in a cluster around a single trampled waterhole, while the rest of the grass grew tall and untouched. And there was a man. He was down by the corral working a fence rail into place, and he did not hear her come. She watched him for a moment. He was tall and lean, and he moved like a man carrying something heavy that nobody else could see. His shoulders were bowed, his hat was pulled low. "Ethan Walker," Clara called. The man went still. Then slow, he turned around. She watched his face when he saw her. She had learned to watch faces. She had learned that the first half-second of a man's face told you everything he would spend the rest of the conversation trying to hide. And Ethan Walker's face in that first half-second fell. He'd been hoping for someone else. That much was plain. He'd been hoping for a small woman, a pretty woman, a soft young thing who'd stir his coffee and never say a hard word. And instead, he'd gotten Clara Whitmore round and heavy and dusty, and 11 days from home, standing at the edge of his dying ranch with a suitcase in her hand. "You're," he started. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "I'm the woman who answered your advertisement. I'm the woman you sent the fare to. I walked 9 miles up from town because you didn't come to collect me, and I'd have walked 90 if I had to. So before you say whatever it is you're about to say, I'll tell you plain I know that look." Ethan blinked. "What look?" "The one on your face right now. The one that says I'm not what you pictured." She set her suitcase down in the dirt. "I've seen it my whole life, Mr. Walker. I saw it on the faces of the folks in your town not 5 hours ago. So you go ahead and say it if you're going to. Say I'm too big or too plain or too much. Get it said. And then we'll talk about what happens next." For a long moment, Ethan Walker didn't say anything at all. He took off his hat and turned it in his hands. He looked at her, and then he looked at the ground, and then he looked out at his ruined ranch, at the thin cattle, and the fallen fences, and the barn door creaking in the wind. "I ain't gonna say any of that," he said finally. "No, no." He put his hat back on. "I'll say something worse. I'll say you shouldn't have come." That landed harder than any of the insults down in town. Clara felt it go through her. But she'd been feeling things go through her for 26 years, and she'd learned how to keep standing anyway. "And why's that?" "Because there's nothing here." Ethan spread his arms, taking in the whole of it. "Look at it. Just look. I put that advertisement out because I was drowning, ma'am. I thought I don't know what I thought. That a wife'd help. That 2 hands were better than 1. But I sent for you before I understood there's nothing left to save here. This ranch is finished. I'm finished. I took your money and your time, and I dragged you across the whole country for a dead thing, and I'm sorry for it. I'll pay your fare back. First thing tomorrow, I'll take you to the stage myself." Clara looked at him. Then she looked past him out at the pasture at the cattle bunched around that one trampled waterhole. "Why are your cows all standing in one spot?" she asked. Ethan frowned. "What?" "Your cattle. There's 40 acres of grass out there, and they're all crowded into one corner of it, standing in the mud. Why, Ethan looked out at them like he was seeing them for the first time. "The water's there. The creek runs through that corner. And you don't move them. Move them where water's water. They go where the water is." Clara nodded slowly, like a woman confirming something she'd already suspected. "They're eating the grass down to dirt in that corner, and letting the rest of it grow to seed and go to waste. And they're standing in their own filth all day, which is why half of them look sick. They're not sick, Mr. Walker. They're just standing in the wrong place because nobody's ever told them any different." Ethan stared at her. "I didn't come here to milk your cows," Clara said. "I mean, I'll milk them. I'll cook your meals and mend your shirts and do every hard thing a wife does. But that's not why I came. I came because your letter said you had land and a man who wasn't afraid of work and nobody else in the whole world who'd help you keep it. And I read that letter, Mr. Walker, and I thought, there's a man who's about to lose everything and doesn't even know that most of what he's losing was never dead to begin with." "You've been here 5 minutes," Ethan said. "I've been here long enough to see 40 acres of good grass going to waste while your cattle starve in the mud," Clara said. "Now, are you going to feed me before dark, or are you going to send me down the mountain hungry?" Ethan Walker looked at this woman for a long, long time. And then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It didn't stay, but it had been there. "There's stew on the stove," he said. "It ain't much." "I've had worse," Clara said, and she picked up her suitcase and walked past him toward the sagging house like she already belonged there. The stew was not much. It was thin and gray, and there was more water in it than meat. But Clara ate 2 bowls of it and didn't complain, and she watched Ethan Walker across the table while she ate, and she took his measure the way she'd learned to take the measure of everyone. He didn't eat much himself. He pushed the stew around the bowl. His hands, she noticed, were a working man's hands, cracked and scarred and strong, but they trembled a little the way a man's hands tremble when he hasn't slept right in a long time. "How long since you had someone cook for you?" she asked. Ethan looked up. "What? You heard me?" He set down his spoon. 4 years. "Since your wife?" Something crossed his face. "Who told you about my wife?" "An old man outside the mercantile. He said you buried her up here." Clara kept her voice gentle, but she didn't look away. "He said you've been burying yourself ever since." Ethan stood up so fast his chair scraped back and nearly tipped over. He carried his bowl to the wash basin and stood there with his back to her. "That's not something I talk about," he said. "All right. With anyone." "All right, Mr. Walker." Clara stayed at the table. "I won't ask again. But I'll say one thing and then I'll leave it be." She waited until he turned around. "A man who buries himself isn't dead. He's just waiting in the dark for a reason to come up. And I don't think you put that advertisement in the paper because you wanted a cook. I think you put it in because some small part of you isn't ready to be buried yet." Ethan Walker stood at the wash basin with the last light coming gray through the window, and he looked at the round-faced woman sitting at his table, and he didn't say anything, because there was nothing he could say that wouldn't have been a lie. "You can have the room at the back," he said finally. "I'll sleep in the barn." "You'll sleep in your own house," Clara said. "I'll take the barn." "I'm not putting a woman in the barn. Then we'll each take a room in the house, and there'll be a door between us, and the good Lord will just have to manage his disappointment," Clara said, standing and gathering both bowls. "I've slept in barns before, Mr. Walker, and I've slept in houses. And I'll tell you the truth, it's not where you sleep that matters. It's whether anybody's glad you're under the roof." She washed the bowls. Ethan watched her do it, and he did not offer to help because he did not know how to do a thing as simple as help anymore, and that shamed him more than the fallen fences or the starving cattle or the sag in his own shoulders. That night, Clara lay in the small back room on a mattress that smelled of dust and mice, and she listened to the house settle and groan around her, and she listened to the wind come down off the high country, and she thought about how far she was from anything she'd ever known. And down the hall, Ethan Walker lay awake in a bed he'd shared for 6 years with a woman who was gone. And for the first time in 4 years, he was not the only living soul under that roof, and he did not know whether that made the ache better or worse. Clara was up before the sun. She didn't wake him. She dressed in the dark, tied back her hair, and went out to the barn to find the milk pail, and she found it hanging where it had hung, gone stiff and cracked from disuse. She found the cow. There was only one milk cow, a bony old Jersey, with sad eyes, standing in a stall, thick with old filth. Clara talked to her while she worked. She'd learned a long time ago that animals didn't care what you looked like. A cow never once looked at Clara Whitmore and decided she was too big or too plain. A cow only cared whether your hands were gentle and your voice was low. "There now," Clara murmured, settling on the stool. "There now, old girl. Nobody's tended you right in a while, have they? Nobody's had the time. Well, I've got the time. I've got nothing but time." The old Jersey turned her head and looked at Clara with one wet brown eye, and then she let down her milk, and the sound of it hitting the pail was the first productive sound that ranch had made in a very long time. When Ethan came out at dawn, rubbing sleep from his eyes, he found the cow milked the stall mucked out clean, and Clara already down at the corral, walking the line of the broken fence with her hands on her hips, studying it. "You didn't have to do the milking," he said. "Somebody had to. That cow was near to bursting." Clara didn't look up from the fence. "How many head you got?" 62. Was 80 before winter. You lost 18 head over one winter. It was a hard winter. It's always a hard winter, Mr. Walker. That's the mountains. The question is, why the hard winter killed your cattle and not your neighbors?" Clara crouched down and looked at a fence post at the way it had rotted at the base. "You know your neighbor fellow, with the big spread to the east." Ethan's face darkened. "Samuel Crow. He lose 18 head last winter." "Crow don't lose anything," Ethan said, and there was something bitter in the way he said it. "Samuel Crow's got the finest herd in 3 counties and money enough to buy the rest. He's been trying to buy me out for 2 years. Clara stood up slowly. "Has he now? Every few months he rides over here in that fine coat of his and offers me a price for the land. Insulting price. Wouldn't cover my debt." Ethan kicked at the fallen fence rail. "Told him no every time. Told him this land was my father's and his father's before that, and I'd sooner burn it than sell it to him. But—" He stopped. "But you're running out of times. You can tell him no." Clara finished. Ethan looked at her. "The banknote's due in the fall. I don't have it. I don't have half of it." He said it flat, like a man reading his own death notice. "So it doesn't much matter what I told Crow. Come November, the bank takes the land, and Crow buys it off the bank for pennies, and either way he wins, and I'm done." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Why does he want it?" "What?" "Crow! He's got the finest herd in 3 counties, you said. Money enough to buy whatever he pleases. So why does he want a dying ranch full of thin cattle and broken fences? What's up here that he wants so bad he's been at it 2 years?" Ethan opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Because in 2 years of Samuel Crow riding over in his fine coat, Ethan had never once asked himself that question. "I don't know," he admitted slowly. "The land, I guess. More land. A man with the finest herd in 3 counties doesn't spend 2 years chasing 40 acres of dead grass for the fun of it," Clara said. "There's something up here he wants. And I'd wager you've been so busy drowning you never once stopped to figure out what it is." She dusted off her hands. "Now, show me these records your father kept." Ethan frowned. "How do you know my father kept records?" "Because a man who buries himself keeps his father's things. Because you told me last night this was your father's land and his father's before him, and you said it like it meant something. Men like that don't throw the old papers away." She started walking toward the house. "There's an office in there somewhere, I'd bet. A desk. A drawer nobody's opened in 4 years. Show me." Ethan Walker followed the round-faced woman back to his own house, and he was beginning to understand that he had not in fact hired a cook. The office was in the back of the house behind a door Ethan hadn't opened since the funeral. It was thick with dust. There was a desk, just as Clara had guessed, and a chair and a shelf of ledgers gone soft with damp. Clara pulled the first ledger down and blew the dust off it and opened it, and she went still. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Clara didn't answer right away. She turned a page, then another. Her eyes moved fast down the columns. "Your father," she said slowly. "Tell me about him." "He died 6 years ago, right before—" Ethan stopped. "Right before my wife. It was a bad couple of years." "Was he a good rancher?" "Best I ever knew. People said he was stubborn, said he wasted his time." Ethan's jaw worked. "He had ideas about cattle. Ideas nobody else had. He was always going on about bloodlines, about breeding animals that could take the winters up here. Everybody laughed at him, said mountain cattle were mountain cattle, and you couldn't change that. He spent 30 years trying to prove them wrong. Did he? I don't know, Ethan said. He died before I understood any of it, and then Sarah died, and He shook his head. I just kept the ones that lived and sold the ones I could, and I never thought about any of it again. Just tried to keep from going under one more month at a time. Clara set the ledger down on the desk very carefully, the way a person sets down something valuable. Mr. Walker, she said, come here, look at this. He came around the desk and looked over her shoulder at the columns of his father's careful hand. Your father tracked every calf born on this ranch for 30 years, Clara said. Every one. Sire, damn date weight. Which ones lived through the winter and which ones didn't? Which cows threw strong calves and which ones threw weak? 30 years of it, Ethan. 30 years of one man breeding toward a single thing, an animal that could survive up here when everything else died. Ethan stared at the columns. To him, they'd always just been numbers. His father's numbers. The obsession of a stubborn old man everyone had laughed at. You said you kept the ones that lived, Clara said. After the hard winters, after your father died, you kept the survivors and sold the rest. Yeah. Do you understand what that means? No. Clara turned around in the chair and looked up at him, and her round face was lit up now in a way he hadn't seen since she stepped off the stage. It means you've been doing your father's work without even knowing it, she said. Every winter that killed off the weak ones, you kept the strong ones. You didn't mean to. You just kept whatever survived because you were too broke to be choosy. But that's exactly what he was doing on purpose for 30 years. Ethan, those 62 head out there aren't a dying herd. They're the end of 30 years of breeding. They're the strongest mountain cattle anywhere in this territory, and you've been about to sell them off for slaughter prices because nobody ever told you what you were standing on. Ethan Walker looked at the ledger. Then he looked out the dusty window at the thin, ribby cattle standing in the mud around the trampled waterhole. Those, he said. Those sorry animals. They look sorry because they're standing in filth and eating dirt, Clara said. Feed them right. Move them off that trampled ground. Let them onto the good grass. Give them one season of proper care, and I promise you, Mr. Walker, come spring you won't recognize them. She stood up. And I think that's what Samuel Crow wants. I think Samuel Crow knew your father. I think Samuel Crow watched that old man work for 30 years and laughed at him with the rest of them, and then watched him die. And I think somewhere along the way, Crow figured out the old man had been right. And now he wants what your father built before you figure out you've got it. For the second time in 2 days, Ethan Walker felt something move in his chest that he'd thought was dead. It hurt the way feeling comes back to a limb that's gone numb hurts. You can't know all that, he said. You've been here one night. No, I can't know it, Clara agreed. Not for certain. But I'll tell you what I do know. I know your father wrote down 30 years of his life in these books, and nobody ever read them till this morning. I know your cattle are dying in the mud when there's good grass 40 feet away. And I know a rich man's been trying to buy a poor man's land for 2 years, and neither of us knows why. She closed the ledger. That's 3 things I know for certain, Mr. Walker. And every one of them says the same thing: this ranch isn't dead. It's just been left in the dark, same as you. Ethan didn't take her down to the stage that morning. He didn't take her the next morning either. By the end of the first week, they had a rhythm. Clara was up before the sun to milk and cook. Ethan mended fence and hauled water. And in the evenings, they sat at the table with his father's ledgers spread between them, and Clara read out the old man's notes, and Ethan translated the parts she didn't understand. And slowly, page by page, 30 years of a dead man's work came back to life. Here, Clara said one night, tapping a page. Your father writes it plain. He says the best mothers are the ones that calve in the shelter of the North Ridge. Says the ones that calve in the open lose their calves to the cold. He's telling you where to put your cows come spring, Ethan. He's telling you from the grave. Ethan leaned over the page. He knew that handwriting. He'd have known it anywhere. And it struck him, sitting there in the lamplight beside this woman he'd tried to send away, that his father was speaking to him for the first time in 6 years. "I used to think he was a fool," Ethan said quietly. "Everybody said so. Crow said so loudest of all. I remember Crow standing right out there in the yard, telling my father to his face that he was chasing a dream that had bankrupted him. And my father just kept writing in these books." "And now Crow wants the books," Clara said. "Now Crow wants the books." They sat in the lamplight, and the wind came down off the mountain, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Why'd you come, Clara?" Ethan asked finally. "The truth this time, not the thing about the letter. A woman like you—" He caught himself. "I mean, a woman as sharp as you. You could have married anybody. Why'd you answer an advertisement from a broken man 900 miles away?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she closed the ledger and folded her hands on top of it. "You want the truth," she said. "All right. The truth is no Mr. Walker. I couldn't have married anybody." She said it plain without a scrap of self-pity. "I'm 26 years old. In the town where I grew up, that makes me a spinster twice over. And I'm built the way I'm built. You saw the look on your own face when I came over that rise. Every man who ever looked at me made that face. My whole life I've been the woman men settle for when they can't get what they want, and I'd rather be alone forever than be somebody's second best. So why answer my letter? Because your letter didn't ask for a pretty wife." Clara looked at him. "It asked for someone who could work. It asked for someone who wasn't afraid of a hard life in a hard place. It was the first time in my whole life a man asked for the thing I actually am instead of the thing I'm not." Her voice was steady, but her hands had tightened on the ledger. "I read that letter and I thought there's a man who might need me for what I can do instead of despising me for what I look like. That's why I came, not for love. I stopped believing in that a long time ago. I came because I was tired of being useless to everyone, and here was a man who might have use for me." Ethan Walker sat across the table from her, and he thought about the look that had crossed his own face when she came over that rise, and he was ashamed of it now, in a way he hadn't been at the time. "I'm sorry," he said, "for that look, when you came up the hill. You don't have to be sorry. It's an honest face. Everybody's got it." Clara stood and gathered the ledgers. "I'd rather have an honest man who makes that face and then feeds me stew than a liar who smiles and puts his hand where it doesn't belong. I met plenty of both kinds down in that town, Mr. Walker, in the 5 hours I was there. I'll take you over any of them." She carried the ledgers to the shelf. And Ethan watched her, and he thought not for the first time that week that he had gone looking for a cook and found something he didn't have a word for yet. Word of the mail-order bride spread through the valley the way word always spread. By the end of the first week, everyone knew Ethan Walker had sent away for a wife and gotten a big plain woman who slapped a man in the street on her first day. And in a place with as little to talk about as that valley that was a feast. They came to see for themselves under one excuse or another. A neighbor rode by to return a borrowed harness that nobody remembered borrowing. 2 women from the church came up with a welcome pie and spent the whole visit staring at Clara like she was an animal in a traveling show. "We just had to come welcome you proper," the taller of the 2 said, holding the pie but not offering it. "Though I'll confess, dear, when we heard Ethan had sent away for a bride, this wasn't quite the picture we had in our minds." "No," said the shorter one, and she smiled with all her teeth. "It surely wasn't." "I imagine not," Clara said, and she took the pie right out of the woman's hands easy as anything. "Well, it was awfully kind of you to climb all this way just to be disappointed in person. Most folks are content to be disappointed in me from a distance. Won't you sit? I'll cut the pie you brought." The 2 women looked at each other. They had come up the mountain to feel tall, and somehow without quite knowing how it had happened, they'd been made to feel small instead. "We can't stay," the taller one said stiffly. "No," Clara agreed. "I don't imagine you can." And every one of them went back down the mountain and reported the same thing. "She's even bigger than they said, and she talks to the cows, and she took the welcome pie right out of Ida Merrick's hands, and never so much as thanked her for it, and she's got Ethan Walker reading dusty old books at his kitchen table like a fool." Clara knew what they thought. She'd always known what people thought, but she'd learned not to spend herself on it. "Let them talk," she told Ethan when the churchwomen had gone. "Talking's free. It's the only thing some folks can afford." But it was harder on Ethan. He'd spent 4 years alone up on that mountain, and he'd forgotten what it felt like to be laughed at, and now it came flooding back. The sidelong looks, the whispers that stopped when he walked into the mercantile, the way the men at the feed store went quiet, and then when he'd passed, burst out laughing. "They're saying I've lost my mind," he told Clara one evening, throwing his hat down on the table harder than he meant to. "Down at the feed store. Heard them with my own ears. Saying Ethan Walker's so far gone he married the first woman desperate enough to have him, and now he's up here talking to a fat woman about cattle bloodlines while the bank takes his land out from under him." Clara didn't flinch at the words. She just kept ladling stew. "And what did you say to them?" she asked. Ethan was quiet. "Nothing," he admitted. "I didn't say anything. I just paid for my feed and left." Clara set a bowl in front of him. Then she sat down across from him and looked at him steady. "Ethan Walker," she said, "I'm going to say something to you, and I want you to hear it. Those men at the feed store, they don't laugh at you because you're a fool. They laugh at you because you're doing something they're too scared to do." "And what's that?" "You're hoping again." Clara said it soft, but it landed hard. "Every one of those men has watched you go under slow for 4 years. And your going under made them feel better about their own lives, because at least they weren't Ethan Walker. But now, here you are up on your dead ranch reading your dead father's books, and feeding your dying cattle, and hoping out loud where they can see it. And that scares them, Ethan, because if a broken man can climb up out of the dark, then what's their excuse for staying down in it?" She picked up her spoon. "So let them laugh. They're not laughing at a fool. They're laughing at a man who's braver than they are. That's the truth of it, and someday they'll all know it. Now eat your stew before it goes cold." Ethan Walker looked at the woman across his table for a long, long moment. And then, he did something he had not done in 4 years. He laughed. It came out rough and rusty like a gate that hadn't been swung in a long time. But it was a real laugh, and it filled up the little kitchen, and Clara looked up at him surprised. And then she was laughing too. "What's funny?" she asked. "Nothing," Ethan said, wiping his eyes. "That's just it. Nothing's funny. Everything's falling apart. The bank's going to take the ranch. The whole valley thinks I've gone soft in the head, and I've got a woman I've known 8 days sitting at my table telling me the truth, like she's known me 8 years. He shook his head. "And for the first time in 4 years, I don't feel like I'm the last man alive up here." Clara's laughter faded into something gentler. "You're not," she said. "You're not the last man alive up here, Ethan Walker. You never were. You just forgot how to hear anybody else." That night, Ethan lay awake in his bed again, but it was different now. The ache was still there. It would always be there. He understood that the way you understand a scar, but there was something else beside it now. Something he was afraid to name because everything he'd ever let himself hope for had been taken from him, and he did not think his heart could survive being emptied out one more time. Down the hall, Clara lay awake too, listening to the mountain wind, thinking about a man who'd made the same disappointed face as every man she'd ever known, and then apologized for it, and then laughed with her at his own kitchen table. She had told him the truth, that she'd stopped believing in love a long time ago. And she'd meant it when she said it. But she was beginning to worry it might not be as true as she needed it to be. The reckoning came on a Sunday, 10 days after Clara arrived. They heard the horse before they saw it. Ethan was up on the barn roof, patching the worst of the holes, and Clara was in the yard, and they both looked up at the sound of hoofbeats coming hard up the north road. The rider crested the rise, and Clara saw a man on a fine, tall horse in a coat that had cost more than everything on the whole ranch put together. He rode like a man who owned every foot of ground he crossed, whether the deed said so or not. Ethan came down off the roof fast. "That's Crow," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "That's Samuel Crow." The man reined up in the yard and looked down at the two of them from the height of his fine horse. And he smiled, and it was the smile of a man who has already decided how a thing is going to end. "Ethan," Crow said. "Been a while. I heard you took a wife." His eyes went to Clara, and they moved over her slow, taking her measure, and whatever he decided it showed in the small, cruel curl of his mouth. "Well, I heard right seems like—" Ethan's hand curled into a fist at his side. "Say what you came to say, Crow. No call to be unfriendly." Crow swung down off his horse easy and stood there brushing dust off his fine coat. "I came to be neighborly. I came to make you an offer. Same as always, only this time, seeing as your situation's gotten a mite more desperate, I figured I'd do you a kindness and raise it." He named a figure. It was more than he'd offered before. It was still an insult. "That'll clear your banknote with a little left over. Enough to get you and the missus started somewhere flat and easy. Somewhere more suited to your—" His eyes flicked to Clara again, circumstances. Ethan opened his mouth, but Clara spoke first. "Mr. Crow," she said, stepping forward, and there was something in her voice that made the rich man actually pause. "Before my husband answers you, I've got a question if you'll indulge me." Crow's eyebrows went up. He looked at her the way a man looks at a dog that's suddenly spoken. "And who's asking?" "Clara Walker," she said, and it was the first time she'd used the name, and she felt Ethan go still beside her at the sound of it. "Ethan's wife. And my question is this. You've got the finest herd in 3 counties, Mr. Crow. That's what they tell me. You've got more land than you can ride across in a day, and more money than you know what to do with. So why in the world have you spent 2 years trying to buy 40 acres of what you keep calling dead ground?" The smile did not leave Samuel Crow's face, but something behind it flickered just for a half second, the way Ethan's face had flickered when Clara came over the rise. And Clara, who had learned to read the first half second of a man's face, read it now. She had guessed right. She saw that she'd guessed right. "A dying ranch is a dying ranch," Crow said smoothly. "I'm doing your husband a favor, ma'am. Nothing more." "No," Clara said. "I don't believe you are. I think you knew Ethan's father. I think you watched that old man do something everyone laughed at for 30 years. And I think you're smarter than the men who laughed, which is why you're here on that fine horse and they're not. I think you figured out the old man was right before anybody else did. And I think you want what he built, Mr. Crow, and you want it bad, and you want it before the man who inherited it ever finds out what it's worth." The yard went very quiet. Samuel Crow looked at the round-faced woman standing between him and the ranch he'd been circling for 2 years, and the smile finally slowly left his face. "Ethan," he said, not taking his eyes off Clara. "Where'd you find this one?" "She found me," Ethan said. And there was something new in his voice now. Something that had been buried 4 years and had just in that moment clawed its way back up into the light. "And she asked you a fair question, Crow. I'd like to hear the answer myself." Samuel Crow stood in the yard of the dying ranch, and he looked from the broken man he'd expected to the pair of hard eyes he hadn't. And for the first time in 2 years, the thing he wanted was not simply going to fall into his hands. He climbed back up onto his fine horse. "My offer's good till the note comes due," he said, gathering his reins. "After that, I'll be buying this land off the bank for a good deal less, and I won't be feeling neighborly about it. You think on that, Ethan. You think hard." His eyes went one last time to Clara. "And you do well not to let a woman do your thinking for you. It's how a man loses everything." He turned the horse and rode down the north road, and they watched him go until he dropped out of sight over the rise. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan turned to Clara, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he's only just begun to understand. "You called yourself Clara Walker," he said. Clara's chin came up just a little. It seemed the thing to say, to him. "I can go back to Whitmore if you'd—" "No," Ethan said. "No, don't." He took off his hat. He turned it in his hands the way he had the first day. "I've been thinking of you as Clara Walker for about a week now," he said. "I just hadn't found the nerve to say it out loud." The wind came down off the mountain, and the two of them stood in the yard of the ranch that everyone said was finished, and for the first time in a very long time, neither Ethan Walker nor Clara Whitmore felt like the thing the world had decided they were. "He's afraid of us," Clara said quietly, watching the empty road where Crow had gone. "Did you see it? That's not the face of a man doing a neighbor a favor. That's the face of a man who's afraid he's going to lose something." "He is afraid," Ethan said. For the first time in his life, Samuel Crow rode away from this ranch without getting what he came for. He looked at her. "Because of you." "Because of your father," Clara corrected. "I only read what he wrote down." She turned toward the house. "But we've got a lot of work to do, Ethan Walker, and not much time to do it in. That note comes due in the fall. Between now and then, we've got to take 62 half-starved cattle and turn them into something a bank can't ignore, and a man like Crow can't steal. We've got to prove your father right, and we've got to do it before the whole valley finishes laughing." She stopped at the door and looked back at him. "Are you with me?" Ethan Walker looked at the woman standing in the doorway of his father's house, and he thought about 4 years of burying himself. And he thought about the disappointed face he'd made when she came over the rise. And he thought about how wrong he'd been about everything, all of it, from the very first moment. "Ma'am," he said, and he put his hat back on his head, and for the first time in 4 years he stood up straight. "I reckon I've been with you since you slapped Dale Preston in the middle of Main Street. I just didn't know it yet." And Clara Whitmore, who had stopped believing in love a long time ago, felt something turn over in her chest that she was going to have to find a word for sooner or later. But not yet. There was work to do first. The work started before the sun the next morning, and it did not stop. Clara had them moving cattle by first light. She stood at the corral gate with one of the old man's ledgers under her arm, and pointed across the pasture toward the far slope where the good grass grew tall and untouched. "We pushed them off the mud today," she said. "All of them. Up onto that north grass." "They won't go," Ethan said. "They've stood by that water hole 2 years. A cow don't change its mind. A cow does exactly what you make it do." Clara handed him a coiled rope. "They're not standing there because they love it. They're standing there because nobody ever gave them a reason to move. Same as everything else on this ranch. It took them the whole morning. The cattle balked and turned and tried to break back for the trampled ground 3 times over, and twice. Ethan lost his temper, and once he lost his hat. But by noon, the herd was strung out across the north slope, heads down, tearing at grass that hadn't been touched in a year. Ethan stood at the top of the rise, breathing hard, watching them eat. "Look at that," he said, and there was wonder in it. "They're feeding. They're actually feeding. They were always going to feed. They just needed somebody to point them at the food." Clara wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "Now, the water. We can't have them walking a mile back to that creek every time they're thirsty, or they'll starve themselves going and coming. Your father write anything about water?" "I don't know what my father wrote about anything. You're the one reading the books." "Then tonight we read the water," Clara said. "But first we haul it. Every barrel we've got up to that slope. We bring the water to the cattle till we figure out how to do it proper." They hauled water until dark. Ethan's shoulders screamed and his hands blistered through the calluses, and Clara worked right beside him, barrel for barrel, and never once complained and never once slowed. And by the time the light went, he understood something about her he hadn't understood before. She wasn't proving anything to him. She wasn't showing off. She simply did not know how to do a thing halfway. That night she found it in the ledger. Here. She smoothed the page flat under the lamp. "Your father dug a spring box up on the North Ridge, 19 years ago. Says it right here, capped the North Spring, ran a wood line down to the upper field." "Ethan, there's water up there already. Your father piped it himself. It's just gone to ruin, same as everything, because nobody knew it was there to keep it up." Ethan came around the table and looked. "A spring box, up on the ridge. Up on the ridge. If we can find it and clear it, your cattle drink on the high grass and never come down to that mud hole again." She looked up at him, and her round face was lit and fierce in the lamplight. "You hear what I'm telling you? Your father solved this problem 19 years ago, and then everyone forgot. The answers are all here, Ethan. Every one of them. He left them for whoever cared enough to read. They found the spring box at the end of the week up on the north ridge, buried under 19 years of leaf and root. The woodline had rotted through in a dozen places, but the spring itself still ran cold and clean and steady, straight out of the mountain, and when Clara knelt and cupped her hands and drank from it, she went very still. "What is it?" Ethan asked. "Taste it." He knelt and drank. It was the sweetest water he'd ever put in his mouth. "That's not creek water," Clara said quietly. "That's mountain snowmelt coming up through rock. That runs cold and clean all summer when every creek in the valleys dropped to mud." She stood up slowly, and there was something new in her face now, something careful. "Ethan, how many springs like this on your land?" "I don't—" He stopped. "There's 3, maybe 4 that I know of. My father always said the ranch sat on more water than any spread in the county. Said that's why his father bought it. Water was cheap when the ranches were empty, and dear when they filled up." Clara turned and looked out over the valley down toward the sprawling green squares of Samuel Crow's land, the finest herd in 3 counties, spread across it like a promise. "Ethan," she said, "how does Crow water that herd of his, all that stock? Where does his water come from?" Ethan frowned. "The Powder. The river runs the length of his east boundary. And in a dry summer when the river drops." He was quiet a moment. "Last 2 summers the Powder ran near dry by August. Crow lost feed, had to haul water to his lower fields." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I think we just found out what Samuel Crow really wants," Clara said, and she put her hand flat on the cold stone of the spring box like a woman making a promise. "It was never your cattle, Ethan. It was never the grass. It's this. A ranch that sits high on the mountain over 4 springs that run cold and clean all summer long, right above a river that goes dry. A man who owns your land owns the water above his own. In a drought, a man who owns your springs owns Samuel Crow." Ethan stared at her. "That's why he's been circling 2 years, Clara said. "It's got nothing to do with the price of beef. He's been watching that river drop every summer, and he's been doing the arithmetic, and he knows that sooner or later a dry year's going to come that breaks the man who doesn't own the high water. He wants your springs before you ever find out they're worth more than the whole rest of the ranch put together." The wind moved across the ridge. Ethan Walker stood over the spring his father had capped 19 years ago and felt the whole shape of his ruin turn inside out in front of him. "He's not trying to buy a dying ranch," Ethan said slowly. "No. He's trying to buy the one thing that could make him rich or ruin him." Ethan's jaw hardened. "And I almost sold it to him. 3 times over. For pennies." "But you didn't," Clara said. "You told him no every time, even when you didn't know why. Some part of you knew Ethan. The same part that put the advertisement in the paper. The part that isn't ready to be buried." She started back down the ridge. "Come on, we've got a spring line to rebuild before that man figures out we know what we're standing on." They rebuilt the water line in 9 days. Ethan cut new pipe from straight pine, and Clara sealed the joints with pitch, and on the 9th day, they opened the spring box, and the cold water ran down the mountain through 19-year-old channels made new, and it filled the upper trough on the high grass, and the cattle came to it and drank and did not once turn back for the mud. Ethan watched them drink, and he did something he hadn't planned. He took off his hat, and he held it against his chest, standing there in the sun. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. "Saying thank you," Ethan said. "To him, my father. I spent 4 years thinking he was a stubborn old fool who wasted his life and left me a ruin. And it turns out he left me everything. I just couldn't read it." His voice caught. "You gave me my father back, Clara. You know that I hadn't heard his voice in 6 years, and you handed it back to me out of a book." Clara didn't say anything. She wasn't good with being thanked. She'd had so little practice at it. "Cattle are watered," she said finally, gruff. "We've got fence to mend before dark." But she was smiling when she said it, and Ethan saw it, and he made a note of it the way a man makes note of a thing he means to see again. The first calf of the new season dropped 3 weeks later in the shelter of the North Ridge, exactly where the old man's ledger said, "The strong mothers calved." Clara was there for it. She'd been watching the cow for 2 days, and when it came, she was on her knees in the grass, with her sleeves rolled up, and Ethan came running at her shout, and together they pulled a big red bull calf into the world. It stood inside the hour. Long-legged, broad-chested, steady on its feet, in a way no calf that thin herd had thrown in years. "Look at him," Clara breathed. "Ethan, look at the chest on him. Look how he stands." She wiped her hands on her apron. "That's 30 years of your father's work standing on 4 legs in the grass. That's the whole thing right there. That's the proof." "That's one calf," Ethan said, but he was grinning like a boy. "That's the first of them, and everyone that comes down out of that north ridge this spring is going to look just like him, and by fall we're going to have a herd of calves that no bank in the territory can look at and call worthless." Clara stood up. "We write down every one, sire damn date weight, same as your father. We build the record back up calf by calf, and when that note comes due, we don't beg the bank for mercy. We show them the proof, and we make them a business proposition." "And what proposition is that?" "That the strongest mountain cattle in the territory are worth more alive on this ranch than dead in a foreclosure sale," Clara said. "We don't ask them to save us out of pity, Ethan. Pity runs out. We make them see there's more money in keeping us than in selling us off to Crow. That's the only kind of mercy a bank understands." "You talk like you've bargained with banks before." "I've bargained with everyone before. When you look like me, child, you learn to talk fast or go hungry." She said it light, but Ethan heard the years underneath it, and he didn't laugh. "Nobody ever gave me a thing for free. Not once in 26 years. Everything I ever got, I got by making a man see it was in his own interest to give it to me. That's a hard way to learn the world, but it turns out it's exactly the way you deal with a bank." She looked down at the calf. Or a thief. It might have worked. It should have worked. But Samuel Crow was not a man who waited to lose. The trouble started small. A section of the new fence came down in the night, and 40 head got out onto the low ground, and it took them a full day to gather them back. Ethan found the fence posts pulled clean, not broken. "That's not weather," he said, holding a post up for Clara to see. "That's hands. Somebody pulled these." 2 nights later, a fire started in the far hay shed. They caught it before it spread, but they lost half the winter feed they'd cut, beating the flames out with wet sacks in the dark, and when it was done, and they stood there black with smoke and shaking, Ethan found the lantern. "This ain't ours," he said. He held it up. His hand was shaking, but not from the smoke. "We don't own a lantern like this. Somebody carried it in here and set my hay alight and dropped it running." Clara took the lantern from him. She turned it in the firelight, and on the base, stamped into the metal, was a name. "Crow Mercantile," she read. The yard went very quiet. "He owns the store in town," Ethan said low. "Half the valley buys their goods stamped with that name. Don't prove anything." "No," Clara agreed. "It doesn't prove anything. That's exactly why he was careless with it. Because it doesn't prove a thing, and he knows it, and he wants us to know it too." She set the lantern down. "This wasn't meant to burn us out, Ethan. If he wanted us burned out, he'd have done it right. This was a message. He's telling us he can reach us any night he likes, and there's nothing we can do about it, and no law that'll help us. Because who's the marshal going to believe Samuel Crow, or a broke rancher, and the wife the whole town laughs at?" Ethan's fists were shaking now for certain. "So what do we do? Just take it, let him burn my hay and pull my fence and grin about it." "No!" Clara's voice was iron. "We do the one thing he doesn't expect. We keep working. We keep building. Every fence he pulls we set again. Every fire he sets we put out. Because a man like Crow is playing a waiting game, Ethan. He's betting we break before the note comes due. He's betting you go back to being the broke man who gives up." She looked at him hard. "The only way we beat him is to not break. To still be standing stronger than ever on the morning that note comes due. Can you do that? Can you not break?" Ethan looked at the wet black ruins of his hayshed. Then he looked at the woman standing beside him in the dark soot on her face and fire in her eyes, refusing to run. "I can't break," he said. "I already broke 4 years ago. I've been broken so long there's nothing left in me to break." He picked up the crow lantern and turned it in his hands. "But I can be rebuilt. You've been showing me that for a month now." He set the lantern down. "We rebuild the shed tomorrow, and we cut more hay. And when he comes to look, he's going to find more feed in that shed than there was before he burned it. Let him chew on that." Clara looked at him, and something moved in her chest, that same something she still hadn't found a word for. "There he is," she said quietly. "There who is." "The man your father wrote all those books for," Clara said. "I've been wondering when he'd show up. Turns out he was just waiting for a reason to stand back up." Ethan looked at the burned shed, then at her black with soot in the dark. "You're not scared," he said. "A man just tried to burn us out in the night, and you're standing there like it's nothing." "Oh, I'm scared," Clara said. "I'm scared plenty. But I learned something a long time ago, Ethan. Fear and running are two different things. A body can be scared clean through, and still put one foot in front of the other. That's all courage ever was, being scared and not running anyway." She wiped her face and only smeared the soot worse. "Crow's counting on us running. He's counting on the fear. So we're going to be scared, you and me, and we're going to stay right here and rebuild that shed bigger, and he's going to learn that scaring us doesn't move us an inch. Now go get some sleep. Tomorrow we cut hay." Ethan looked at her a long moment in the dark. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he found to his own surprise that he meant it. The town banker came up the mountain the following week, and his name was Harlan Voss, and he did not come alone. Samuel Crow rode up beside him. Ethan saw them coming, and his whole body went tight. "That's Voss, from the bank. What's he doing riding with Crow?" "Nothing good," Clara said. "Let me talk, and Ethan, whatever he says, don't you sign a single thing. Not one paper. Not today." Voss was a soft, round man in a town suit, and he dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief the whole time he spoke, and he could not look Ethan in the eye. Crow sat his fine horse a little behind, saying nothing, watching everything. "Mr. Walker," Voss began, "I'll come straight to it. I'm afraid the banks had to reconsider the terms of your note." "Reconsider how?" "The board's grown concerned about the security of the loan, given the—" Voss glanced back at Crow just once quick, and Clara caught it. "Given the condition of the property, we're calling the note. In full. 30 days. Ethan went white. 30 days. It's not due till fall. We had till November. "The board has the right to call the note if it judges the securities at risk," Voss said, dabbing. "I'm sorry, Ethan. Truly. 30 days or the bank forecloses. And then Crow buys it off the bank," Clara said. It wasn't a question. Voss wouldn't look at her. "Any sale after foreclosure would be handled fairly and publicly, ma'am." "Handled fairly and publicly," Clara repeated. "By a bank whose loan officer rode up this mountain shoulder to shoulder with the one man in the whole territory who wants this land." She stepped forward. "Mr. Voss, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think hard before you answer it, because it's the kind of question that has a way of getting asked again in front of a judge someday. Did the board reconsider this note, or did Samuel Crow reconsider it for them?" The handkerchief stopped moving. "I don't know what you're implying," Voss said, but his voice had gone thin. "I'm implying that a man who owns half the debt in this valley might own a piece of his banker too," Clara said. "I'm implying that this note got called the same week we found out what's really under this land. I'm implying you've been sent up here to frighten a broken man into signing his ruin, and I'm telling you plain it isn't going to work, because that man isn't broken anymore, and he isn't signing anything today." Crow spoke for the first time, then easy and cold from the back of his horse. "You've got a mouth on you, Mrs. Walker." "I do, Mr. Crow. It's about the only thing folks ever gave me leave to have." Clara turned to face him. 30 days. All right. We'll take your 30 days. And on the 30th day, my husband is going to walk into that bank with a herd of the strongest cattle in this territory, and a record book 30 years deep, and he's going to pay that note in full, or make the bank a deal it can't refuse. And you, Mr. Crow, you're going to have to find your water somewhere else." She saw it land. She saw the word water go into him like a knife, saw his face change just for that half-second before he mastered it. "You told her," Crow said to Ethan, and there was something almost like fear under the cold now. "About the springs. Nobody told me anything," Clara said. "I read it, in a dead man's book. The same book everyone in this valley laughed at Mr. Crow, including you." She smiled at him, and it was not a warm smile. "You should have bought this ranch back when you still could have fooled a grieving man into selling it cheap. You waited too long. You waited until somebody came along who could read." For a long moment, Samuel Crow said nothing at all. Then he gathered his reins. 30 days, Ethan," he said. "Enjoy them. Because there's not a herd on God's earth you can build in 30 days that's worth what that note costs. And when the bank takes this ranch, and it will, I'll own your springs and your grass and your father's precious books, and I'll burn every one of them in my own fireplace while I watch that snowmelt fill my troughs." He turned the horse. "You should have sold, boy. You should have sold while a fool would still have bought it." They rode down the mountain, Voss trailing behind like a whipped dog, and Ethan and Clara stood in the yard watching them go. 30 days, Ethan said. His voice was hollow. "Clara, he's right. We can't raise that money in 30 days. The calves aren't grown. Nobody buys unproven stock. We've got nothing to sell that'd cover half of it." "No," Clara said. "We don't." "Then what do we do?" Clara was quiet a long moment, watching the dust settle on the empty road. And when she spoke, there was a new hardness in her, the hardness of a woman who has just decided to do a thing she's afraid of. "We stopped playing his game," she said. 30 days isn't enough time to raise money, but it's enough time to raise the truth. Crow's whole plan only works in the dark, Ethan. It only works as long as folks believe you're a broken fool and I'm a joke and this ranch is dead. The minute the whole valley knows what's really up here, the minute they know a rich man's been trying to steal the high water out from under a poor one, Crow can't touch us. He can't foreclose quiet. He can't burn us out quiet. Everything he's done only works because nobody's watching. So we make them watch," Ethan said slowly. "We make them watch." Clara turned to him. "How far to the county seat?" 2 days' ride. "Why?" "Because a town banker can be bought, but a federal land office keeps records nobody in this valley can touch. Every deed, every water claim, every foreclosure filing. If Crow's been maneuvering with Voss, there'll be a paper trail, and it'll be sitting in a drawer at the county seat where Crow's money doesn't reach." Clara's eyes were bright now, fierce. "We don't fight him here, Ethan, on his ground where he owns the bank and the store and half the men in town. We go where he can't follow. We go to the record. That's 2 days there and 2 days back, 4 days gone out of 30. Then we'd best not waste any of the other 26. Clara was already moving toward the house. "I'll ride to the county seat. You stay and hold the ranch somebody has to, or he'll burn the rest of it the minute we're both gone. I'll go through every deed and every filing with this land's name on it, and I'll find out exactly what Samuel Crow has done in the dark. And then we're going to drag it out into the light where the whole valley can see it." Ethan caught her arm. "You're not riding 2 days alone. Not with Crow's men out there pulling fences and lighting fires in the night. Absolutely not." Clara stopped. She looked down at his hand on her arm. It was the first time he'd touched her. "Ethan Walker," she said gentler now, "in 26 years, you're the first man who ever worried about me getting somewhere safe, instead of worrying about getting rid of me." She covered his hand with hers, just for a moment. "But somebody has to hold the ranch, and somebody has to ride, and I'm the one who knows what to look for in those records. It has to be me." "Then take the shotgun," Ethan said. "And take my father's horse. She's the fastest thing on this mountain, and she knows the trails in the dark. And Clara," he held her eyes. "You come back. You hear me? You find what you find, and you come back. I didn't get you back just to lose you on a road." Clara looked at him a long moment. And whatever it was in her chest that she hadn't found a word for, she found it right then, standing in the yard with his hand under hers. She just wasn't ready to say it out loud. "I'll come back," she said. I always come back, Ethan. It's the only thing I've ever been good at not stopping. She rode out at first light the next morning with the shotgun across her saddle and 2 days' bread in her bag, and Ethan stood in the yard and watched her go until she dropped over the rise, the same rise she'd come over a month ago with a suitcase in her hand, and disappointment on his face. He did not feel disappointment now. He felt something closer to terror, the terror of a man who has just remembered he has something left to lose. She reached the county seat on the second evening saddle-sore and dust-caked, and she slept a few hours in a boarding house and was standing outside the land office door when it opened at 8 the next morning. But 2 days back on the mountain, while Clara bent over dusty drawers, Ethan Walker faced Crow's men alone. They came at dusk, 3 of them riding easy up the north road like they had every right to it. Ethan saw them from the barn roof and came down and met them in the yard with his father's rifle held loose across his arms, not pointed, not lowered. "Evening," the lead man said. He had a hard, flat face and a Crow brand on his saddle. "Mr. Crow sent us up to look over the property, seeing as he'll be owning it soon. Wants an accounting of what's here." "He doesn't own it yet," Ethan said. "Near enough." The man swung a leg over to dismount. "Now you just stand aside, Walker, and let us have our look. No cause for trouble." Ethan didn't move. He didn't raise the rifle either. He just stood there in the mouth of his own yard, and something in the way he stood made the man's boot stop halfway to the ground. 4 years ago. Ethan said quiet, "I'd have let you. 4 years ago, I was so far down, I'd have let any man ride over me that wanted to. But something changed on this ranch a month back, and I'll tell you what it is, so you can carry it to Crow." He took 1 step forward. A woman walked up that road with a suitcase, and she looked at everything. The whole valley called dead. My cattle, my land, my father's name. Me, and she saw it wasn't dead at all, just waiting. And I've decided I'm done waiting. So you get back on that horse and you tell Samuel Crow that Ethan Walker was standing in his own yard when you found him, and he'll be standing in it when the note comes due, and he'll be standing in it the day after. Now ride." The man looked at him a long moment. Whatever he'd expected to find up on that mountain, it wasn't this. He put his boot back in the stirrup. "He said you'd be broke and begging," the man said. "He's got old information," Ethan said. "Ride." They rode. And Ethan Walker stood in his yard, in the last light, and watched them go. And his hands were shaking, and he was grinning like a fool, because for the first time in 4 years he had stood his ground in front of men who came to take his home, and he had not moved an inch. "You should see me now, Pa," he said to the empty yard. "You should just see me now." The clerk at the county seat was a young man with ink-stained fingers, who took 1 look at Clara and started to say something about how the records weren't for just anyone to go rifling through, and Clara set both hands flat on his counter and looked at him until he stopped. "Young man," she said, "I have ridden 2 days, and I have 24 left to save my husband's land from a thief. I am going to look at every filing this office holds on a property called Black Hollow Ranch in the Powder River Valley, and on the holdings of a man named Samuel Crow, and on the loans of a bank officer named Harlan Voss. And you are going to help me because it is your job, and because somewhere in these drawers is the truth, and I have come a very long way to find it." The clerk looked at her round, tired, absolutely unyielding face. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he opened the drawers. She read all day. She read deeds going back 40 years. Water claims filed in a dead man's careful hand, foreclosure notices, transfers, liens. Her eyes burned and her back ached, and she did not stop. And in the middle of the afternoon, in a drawer of recent filings, she found it. She found it, and she went cold all over, and she read it 3 times to be sure. It was a transfer of debt. 6 months old. It recorded in plain county ink that the note on Black Hollow Ranch, the note Harlan Voss claimed the bank board had reconsidered, was no longer held by the bank at all. It had been quietly bought out, 6 months ago, by a private party, by Samuel Crow. Ethan had never owed the bank a thing since winter. He'd owed Samuel Crow. Crow had held Ethan's whole ruin in his own hand for 6 months, and had ridden up that mountain playing the friendly neighbor, and had sent Voss to lie about a board that had nothing to do with it, because if Ethan ever found out the truth, he'd have known there was no bank to bargain with, no board to persuade, no fair public sale to hope for. There was only Crow. There had only ever been Crow. Clara sat in the land office with the paper shaking in her hand and understood at last exactly how deep the trap went. And then she understood something worse. Because if Crow held the note privately, then Crow could foreclose the instant it came due with no bank board and no waiting and no fair sale. He could take the ranch in a single afternoon, and there would be nobody to appeal to because the debt had never belonged to anyone but him. Unless Clara turned back to the water claims. She read them again, slower this time, and her heart began to pound, because there in the dead man's hand were 4 spring claims filed and recorded and stamped by this very office 19 years ago, and never once canceled, never transferred, never touched. They belonged in the eyes of the federal government to the estate of the man who'd filed them, to Ethan's father, and through him to Ethan. Crow could foreclose on the ranch. But the water claims were filed separate under federal law, and a foreclosure on the land did not touch them. Whoever took the ranch would take the grass and the fences and the house. But the water, the cold, clean, drought-proof water that was the only thing Samuel Crow had ever truly wanted, would still belong to Ethan Walker. Foreclosure or no foreclosure. Crow could take everything. Except the one thing he'd come for. Clara pressed the claims flat on the counter with both hands and started very quietly to laugh. "Young man," she said to the clerk, "I'm going to need certified copies of every one of these, stamped, sealed, and dated by this office. And I'm going to need them today because I have a 2-day ride ahead of me and a man waiting at the end of it who's about to find out he was never nearly as ruined as he thought." She rode out at dawn the next morning with the copies sealed in oilcloth against her chest, and she pushed the old man's fast horse harder than she'd ever pushed an animal in her life, because there were only 22 days left now, and she finally knew, not hoped, not guessed, but knew exactly how they were going to win. She just had to live to tell him. Behind her, 2 days back on the mountain, Ethan Walker mended fence in the dark and slept with the shotgun beside him and counted the hours until the rise brought her back. And ahead of her down in the valley, Samuel Crow sat in his fine house with a foreclosure paper already drawn up and dated, believing the way men like him always believe that a thing is finished the moment they have decided it is finished. He did not know that the round-faced woman was riding through the dark toward him, with the truth sealed against her heart. He was about to find out. They came for her on the second night of the ride home. Clara was 3 hours from the mountain, moving the old man's horse careful through the dark along the low road when she heard riders behind her. 2 of them, maybe 3 coming fast, and no honest man rode a night trail at that speed. She'd been half expecting it since she left the county seat. A man like Crow kept eyes on the roads. She didn't run. Running was what they wanted, a scared woman bolting into the dark on strange ground where a horse could break a leg and end the whole thing. She turned off the road instead into the black timber, and she got down and put her hand over the horse's nose and stood dead still with the shotgun across her arm and the oilcloth packet cold against her heart. The riders came up the road. She heard one of them speak low. "She's got to be along here somewhere. Crow wants them papers, whatever she found. Said don't come back without 'em." And the woman... A pause. "He said the papers. He didn't say nothing about bringing the woman back." Clara's blood went to ice. She understood standing there in the dark exactly what that meant. This was no longer about frightening her. This was about a paper that could ruin Samuel Crow and a witness who'd read it. She stood so still she might have been a tree. The horse stood with her. God bless the old man's training. And the riders passed by not 40 feet from where she stood close enough that she could smell the horses, and they went on up the road looking for a woman who was no longer on it. She waited an hour. Then she led the horse back to the road on foot, and she did not mount up and gallop for home like her heart was screaming at her to do. She walked the horse slow and quiet for 2 miles until she was well past them, and only then did she climb up and ride. And she rode the rest of the night by the stars alone off the road over ground she didn't know because the road belonged to Crow now and she couldn't trust it. Once near midnight, she nearly lost it all. The horse put a foot wrong on a scree slope in the dark and went down to one knee, and Clara felt the whole world tip, and she grabbed a fistful of mane and threw her weight back, and somehow the old mare found her feet again, blowing hard, trembling. Clara sat there in the black, with her heart slamming and the oilcloth packet still against her chest, and she pressed her face to the horse's neck and whispered, "Not now, not this close. We don't get to fall now." They didn't fall. She came over the rise into the ranch yard just as the sun broke filthy and swaying in the saddle, and Ethan was already running before she'd stopped pulling her down off the horse and into his arms like a man catching something he'd been sure he'd lost. "You're back. You're back. Thank God." He held her at arm's length, checking her over. "You're hurt. No, that's just dirt." Clara, I've been out of my mind. What happened? You look like you rode through the pit." "Crow's men," she said. Her voice cracked. She hadn't spoken aloud in a day. "On the road last night. They weren't hunting for papers, Ethan. Not just papers. I heard them. Crow told them the woman didn't need to come back." Ethan went very still. Then something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Not fear, not grief, but a cold and terrible anger. "He sent men to kill you," he said. "He sent men to make me disappear," Clara said. "There's a difference to a man like Crow. He'd never call it killing. He'd call it removing a problem." She pulled the oilcloth packet out and pressed it into his hands. "But it doesn't matter, Ethan, because I got what I went for. I got it, and I got it home, and now we've got him. We've finally got him." Ethan looked down at the packet. "What is it? Come inside, sit down, and listen. Because everything you thought about your situation is wrong." She told him at the kitchen table with the certified copies spread between them. She told him about the debt transfer, that his note hadn't belonged to the bank in 6 months, that he'd been in Samuel Crow's pocket the whole time without knowing it, that Voss and the bank board were a lie built to keep him from ever finding out. Ethan's face drained white. "So there's no bank. There was never any bank. It's just been Crow, the whole time." "The whole time. Then we're finished." He shoved back from the table. "Clara, that's worse. That's so much worse. A bank you can bargain with. A bank wants its money. But Crow don't want money. He wants the land, and he holds the note himself, so the day it comes due, he forecloses, and there's nobody to stop him. No board, no fair sale, nothing." He put his face in his hands. "You rode 2 days and near got killed to bring me the news that it's even more hopeless than I thought. Ethan Walker, take your face out of your hands and look at me." He looked up. "There's more," Clara said, and now she was smiling the fierce lit-up smile from the ridge. "The water claims. Your father's 4 springs. He filed them separate 19 years ago under federal law, not as part of the ranch deed, but as their own thing. Their own claims. And Ethan, a foreclosure on the land doesn't touch a federal water claim. It can't. Crow can foreclose till he's blue in the face. He can take the grass and the fences and the house and every stick of furniture in it." She leaned across the table. "But he cannot take the water. The water stays yours. It stays yours no matter what he does to the rest, because the law that holds it is bigger than any note he could ever buy." Ethan stared at her. "Say that again," he whispered. "He can take the ranch," Clara said slowly, "and still not get the one thing he came for. He'll foreclose on Black Hollow and find out he's bought 40 acres of grass over 4 springs that will never ever be his. He'll own a dry shell. And you'll own the only cold water on this whole mountain in a drought year. Which means, Ethan, if we play it right, Samuel Crow forecloses on you and wakes up the next morning owing you for the water to keep his own herd alive." For a long moment, Ethan couldn't speak. "He doesn't know," he finally said. "Does he? He doesn't know the claims are separate. I don't think he does. I think he's been so sure that owning the land means owning everything on it that he never checked. Rich men get lazy, Ethan. They stop reading the fine print because they've never once had to." Clara stood up. "But we can't just spring it on him quiet in his own house where he can burn the papers and swear he never saw them. We have to do it in the light, in front of the whole valley, in front of the law, so that when the truth comes out, there's 100 witnesses and it can never be buried again. How Crow owns the marshal same as he owns Voss. The local marshal maybe, but water claims are federal." Clara's eyes were hard and bright. And I didn't just get copies at the county seat, Ethan. I wrote a letter to the federal land office in the territorial capital. I told them a private party looked to be maneuvering to seize federally claimed water through a foreclosure, and I asked them to send a land agent to witness the note coming due. She let that sit. If they come, and I think they will because nothing lights a government fire like somebody trying to steal what the government's already got its stamp on, then Crow won't be facing a broke rancher and the wife the town laughs at. He'll be facing the United States, and there's not enough money in the Powder River Valley to buy that. Ethan Walker looked at the woman standing in his kitchen, filthy from 2 days on the run, who had been hunted through the dark and come home anyway with a way to beat the man who'd hunted her. I have known you 2 months, he said quiet, and in 2 months you have given me back my father, my land, my nerve, and now maybe my whole future. And I have given you nothing but a room that smells of mice and stew that ain't fit for a dog. You gave me a place where what I can do matters, Clara said. You've got no idea, Ethan Walker, what that's worth to a woman who spent her whole life being told she was worth nothing at all. They stood there a moment, the two of them in the small kitchen, and something passed between them that neither one had the courage yet to name. Then the drought came, and it changed everything. It started as just a dry spell, the kind the valley saw most summers. But the dry spell didn't break. 2 weeks passed without rain, then 3. The Powder River, which ran the length of Samuel Crow's east boundary, dropped and dropped from a river to a stream, to a muddy trickle a man could step across. And Crow's fine herd, the finest in 3 counties, began to suffer. Word of it climbed the mountain the way all word did. The neighbor who'd once ridden up to return a borrowed harness came again, and this time he didn't pretend. "It's bad down below Walker," the man said, hat in his hands. "Crow's lost 20 head already to the heat and the bad water. That river's near dry. Half the valley's hauling water twice a day, just to keep their stock breathing." He glanced past Ethan up the slope to where the black hollow cattle stood fat and shining on green grass around a trough that ran cold and clear. "And here you are, green as spring. How in the middle of the worst dry in 10 years. How? Springs," Ethan said. 4 of them. Cold water straight out of the mountain runs all summer no matter what the sky does. My father capped them 19 years ago. He looked at the man steady. Same father the whole valley called a fool. Same father Samuel Crow laughed at. Turns out the old man knew something the rest of you didn't. Turns out this dead ranch nobody wanted is the only wet ground on the mountain in a dry year. The neighbor looked up at that green slope for a long, long moment. "There's men down there," he said slowly, "who'd pay near anything for water like that right now, to keep their herds alive." "I imagine there are," Ethan said, and 2 days later they came, not one man but a handful riding up the mountain, hats in hand. The same men who'd gone quiet and then laughed when Ethan passed them at the feed store. They stood in his yard now with the drought in their faces and the fear of ruin in their eyes, and they could barely get the words out. "Walker," the oldest of them said, "we come to ask, that is, we'd pay fair price whatever you name, could we water some stock up here? Just till the rains come. I got 40 head, won't last the week down below." Ethan looked at them. These were men who'd watched him go under for 4 years and never once climbed this mountain to lend a hand. Men who'd laughed at his father, laughed at his wife, laughed at him. And now they stood in his yard begging for the water that fool old man had left in the ground. He could have turned them away. Part of him wanted to. "You laughed at my father," Ethan said quietly. "Every one of you. You called him a fool for 30 years, and now you want to drink his water." The men looked at their boots. Clara stepped up beside Ethan then and put her hand on his arm, and she spoke low, just for him. "Ethan, a hard man would send them off dry. But your father didn't cap those springs to spite anybody. He capped them so nothing on this mountain would ever have to die of thirst again. Don't let Crow turn you into the kind of man who'd let a neighbor's herd die to settle a score. That's his game. Don't play it." Ethan was quiet a moment. Then he turned back to the men. "Bring your stock up," he said. "No charge. My father's water freely given, same as he'd have wanted. But you'll remember this, all of you. You'll remember who let your herds live, when the man in the fine coat down below wouldn't lift a finger. He set his jaw. And when the day comes that I need this valley to stand with me, and it's coming soon, you'll remember that too. The oldest man's eyes went wet. We'll remember, Walker. God is my witness. We'll remember. They drove their thirsty cattle up the mountain that afternoon, and the springs that everyone had forgotten watered half the valley's stock. And by nightfall, the whole of the Powder River country knew two things. It hadn't known that morning that the dead ranch was the only living ground on the mountain, and that the man they'd all written off had opened it to them when he'd have had every right to shut them out. Clara, watching, understood that the drought had just handed them something even better than the law. The drought had handed them proof the whole valley could see with its own eyes that everything the town had laughed at was true. That the dead ranch wasn't dead. That the fool father wasn't a fool. That the broke man and his plain wife had been right, and Samuel Crow, watching his prize herd die of thirst while green water ran down the mountain above him, had been wrong. Crow knew it too, and it made him desperate. The note had 11 days left to run when the poisoning happened. Ethan found the first dead calf at dawn, down by the lower spring, and then a second, and Clara came running at his shout and knelt in the grass and smelled the water and went white. "Don't let the cattle near it," she said sharp. "Any of them. Somebody's fouled the lower spring, poison or lie or—" She stood shaking with fury. "He's poisoning the water, Ethan. He's decided if he can't have it, nobody will. He'd rather ruin the springs than lose them. Then we lose the water. If the springs are poisoned, one spring, the lower one, and it's the smallest. He can't reach the others. The north spring's an hour's climb, and the upper two are inside the fence line we watch." Clara wiped her mouth. "But this is good, Ethan. Do you hear me? This is a mistake. Up till now, everything Crow's done, he's done clever. The note, the fire, the men on the road, all of it deniable, all of it quiet. But a poisoned spring in the middle of a drought with dead calves in the grass? That's the kind of thing a federal agent looks at real hard. That's the kind of thing that hangs a man." She looked down at the fouled water. "He's getting scared. Scared men get careless. We keep the other springs guarded day and night, and we save one of these dead calves and one jar of this water sealed for the agent. And we hold on. 11 more days. That's all. 11 days, and this is over one way or the other." They guarded the springs in shifts. After that, one of them always awake, always watching through 11 of the longest nights either of them had ever known. And in the small hours sitting up by the north spring with the shotgun across her knees, Clara found herself telling Ethan things she'd never told a living soul. "I had a family once," she said one night low into the dark. "Back east. A mother, a father, 3 sisters. Pretty sisters. Married off every one of them by the time they were 20. And me." She was quiet a moment. "My own mother told me the year I turned 19 that I'd best make my peace with being the one who stayed home to nurse her and my father into the grave. Because no man was going to have me. She said it kind. That was the worst of it. She said it like she was doing me a mercy, telling me the truth early, so I'd stop hoping." Ethan didn't say anything. He'd learned when not to. "So I stopped hoping," Clara said. "For a long time. I nursed my father till he died. I nursed my mother till she died. And then I was 26, but I felt like 100, and there was nothing left. No family, no husband, no place. Just a big plain woman, alone in a house full of dead people's things." Her voice was very steady the way it got when the thing underneath it wasn't. "And then I saw an advertisement in a paper, from a man in Montana who didn't want a pretty wife, who wanted somebody who could work, somebody who wasn't afraid of a hard life." She turned and looked at him in the starlight. "I didn't come here for love, Ethan. I told you that the first week, and I meant it. I came because I was drowning too. Just quieter than you. I came because it was the last hope I had left, and it wasn't even much of one. And now?" Ethan asked. His voice was rough. Clara looked at him a long moment. And now I don't know what to call what I came for anymore, she said. But it isn't the thing I came for. It's something I didn't dare hope for, and it scares me worse than Crow ever could. Ethan reached over in the dark and took her hand, and he held it, and neither of them said anything else, and the cold spring ran on beside them all night long. The next night, it was Ethan who talked. I never told anybody how Sarah died, he said out of nowhere, the words coming slow like they hurt. The valley thinks it was fever. It wasn't. It was the winter after my father passed. We lost near the whole herd that year, and I was so deep in trying to save the ranch that He stopped. She got sick in November. I kept telling myself she'd mend because I couldn't afford to stop working, because if I stopped, the ranch died. I chose the cattle over sitting with my own wife, and by the time I finally understood how bad it was too late to get a doctor up the mountain in the snow. His voice broke. She died thinking I loved the land more than her, and I let her think it because I was too busy drowning to tell her different. That's the thing I've carried 4 years, Clara. Not that she died, that I let her die alone believing she came second. Clara was quiet a long time. You didn't love the land more than her, she said finally. You loved her so much you were killing yourself trying to save the thing you'd built together. You just never learned how to say it out loud. Some men don't. It's not the same as not feeling it, Ethan. She tightened her hand around his. And I'll tell you something else. A man who's carried that guilt 4 years without once letting himself off the hook, that's not a man who loved his wife too little. That's a man who loved her too much to forgive himself. Sarah knew. Wherever she is, she knew. Ethan Walker put his face down against their joined hands, and for the first time in 4 years, up on that ridge in the dark, beside the cold running spring, he wept. Not the choked-down grief he'd carried alone, but the real thing, finally let go, and Clara held on to him, and didn't say a word, because some things a person just has to be allowed to set down. When it was done, he sat up and wiped his face and looked at her, and there was something clear in him now that hadn't been there before. 2 months ago, I made a face when you came over that rise, he said. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for that face. On the morning the note came due, they rode down the mountain together. They'd sent word ahead. Clara had seen to that too. Days before, riding to every ranch in the valley she could reach and telling each one the same thing, come to the bank on the morning of the 15th and see for yourselves what Samuel Crow has been doing in the dark. Some had laughed at her, but the drought had done its work on the valley's mind. Every man of them was hauling water now, watching his stock die, and every man of them had seen the green slope of Black Hollow shining above them. They came. By the dozens they came, until the street outside the bank was thick with the whole valley, and the men who'd laughed loudest at the mail-order bride stood shoulder to shoulder waiting to see what she'd do. Samuel Crow was already there on the bank steps in his fine coat, with Voss beside him dabbing at his forehead and a foreclosure paper in his hand. He watched Ethan and Clara ride up through the crowd, and his face was the face of a man who has counted his winnings 100 times and cannot imagine losing. Ethan, Crow called out loud for the crowd. You're prompt, I'll give you that. Come to hand over the keys like a man, have you? He held up the foreclosure paper. The note's due. You can't pay it. Everybody here knows you can't pay it. So we'll do this clean in front of witnesses, and you and the missus can be off my land by sundown. Your land, Ethan said. My land, as of this morning. Clara swung down off her horse, and the whole crowd went quiet, because there was something in the way she moved through them, the big plain woman they'd all laughed at, that made them step back and let her through. Mr. Crow, she said, and she climbed the first step so the whole street could hear her. Before you foreclose on my husband, I've got a few papers of my own I'd like these good people to see, and I've got a question or two I'd like you to answer, in front of all of them. Crow's smile thinned. The note's due, Mrs. Walker. There's nothing to discuss. Voss. The note's due, that's true, Clara said, cutting across him loud and clear. But here's the first thing this valley ought to know. That note isn't held by the bank. It hasn't been for 6 months. She turned and held up a certified copy so the crowd could see the county seal. Samuel Crow bought it himself in secret and sent his banker up the mountain to lie about it. There's no bank board. There never was. This whole thing has been one rich man dressed up as a fair deal. It's all right here, stamped by the county. Any man who can read is welcome to check it." A murmur went through the crowd. Voss went the color of paste. Crow's jaw tightened, but he recovered fast. Men like him always did. "So I bought a bad debt. That's not a crime. It's business. The note's still due, and he still can't pay it, and I still foreclose. You've proved nothing, woman, except that I'm shrewder than a broke rancher. The valley knew that already." "Oh, I'm not done," Clara said. "That was just the first thing. Here's the second." She turned to the crowd, and she raised her voice, and it carried down the whole street. "Every man here is hauling water this morning. Every one of you is watching your stock die because that river's gone dry. And every one of you has looked up at Black Hollow and seen it green as May in the worst drought in 10 years and wondered how." She let it hang. "I'll tell you how. 4 springs. Cold mountain water that runs all summer no matter what the sky does. Springs that Ethan's father found and capped 19 years ago, the same man this whole valley called a fool. And Samuel Crow has known about that water for 2 years. That's the real reason he's been trying to take this ranch. Not the grass, not the cattle, the water. He's been trying to buy the only wet ground on this mountain out from under a grieving man cheap before any of you figured out what a drought would make it worth." The murmur became something louder. Crow's voice cracked out over it. "Speculation? Wild talk from a woman who... And here's the third thing." Clara pulled the last packet from inside her coat and held it high, and the county seal caught the morning light. "Ethan's father didn't just cap those springs, he filed on them. Federal water claims 19 years ago recorded and stamped and never once canceled. And a federal water claim, Mr. Crow." She turned and looked him dead in the eye, and her voice dropped so the whole silent street had to lean in to hear it. "Is not touched by a foreclosure. You can take the land. The law says you can take the land. But the water was never part of the land, and it stays with the Walker name no matter whose name is on the deed. So go ahead. Foreclose. Take your dry shell of a ranch." She smiled at him, terrible and calm. "And tomorrow morning, when your herd is dying of thirst, you can come up the mountain and ask my husband real polite whether he'd care to sell you a little water." The crowd had gone from murmuring to roaring now. An old rancher near the front, one of the men who'd watered his stock on Black Hollow 2 days before, turned to the man beside him loud enough for the street to hear. "She's right. I drank that water myself. Coldest, cleanest water on the mountain, and that boy give it to us free while Crow let us hang." Another voice took it up. Then another. And Ethan Walker, standing at the foot of the bank steps, watched the whole valley that had laughed at him turn man by man to his side. "You put them up to this," Crow snarled at Clara. "You bought them with my water. Your water." Clara laughed sharp and clear. "You just heard the whole street. It was never your water, Mr. Crow. That's the whole trouble. It never once was." For one long, ringing moment, Samuel Crow stood on the bank steps with the foreclosure paper in his hand, and his face came apart first. The disbelief, then the frantic calculation, then at last the pure white rage of a man who has just understood he has been beaten by the one person in the world he thought beneath his notice. "You're lying," he said, but his voice had gone thin and high. "Those claims, don't they can't Voss. Voss is she tell them she's lying, tell them." But Voss was backing away from him now, down the steps into the crowd, wanting no part of what was coming. "I never poisoned any spring, Samuel," the banker said, loud, desperate, saving his own skin. "Whatever you did up on that mountain that's yours, that's not on me. I only ever handled the note. Shut your mouth, you fool." Crow wheeled on him, and the whole street heard it. Heard the banker name Crow's crime, and heard Crow fail to deny it, and something in the crowd's temper shifted from anger to something colder and more certain. And that was when Clara said the last thing, the thing she'd been holding back, and dropped it into the silence like a stone into a still pond. "Oh, and Mr. Crow, one more thing this valley ought to hear. 2 nights ago, somebody poisoned the lower spring on our land. Killed 3 calves. Left them dead in the grass." She reached into her saddlebag and lifted out a sealed jar of fouled water and held it up for all of them to see. "I've got the water sealed. I've got a dead calf kept cold. And I've got a letter already answered from the federal land office in the capital, because it turns out the government takes a real dim view of a man trying to destroy claims that carry its own stamp. She turned to the crowd. There's a United States land agent riding into this valley as we speak, and when he gets here, he's going to want to know who poisoned a federal water source in the middle of a drought. So I'd think hard, all of you, about which side of this you want to be standing on when the government arrives. The whole street erupted, and Samuel Crow, cornered on the bank steps in front of the entire valley, with his lie exposed and his crime named, and the law itself riding toward him, did the thing that cornered men do when everything they've built comes down at once. His hand went to the pistol at his hip. "Crow, don't!" someone shouted. But the big plain woman he'd hunted through the dark, the woman he'd tried to make disappear, the woman the whole valley had laughed at, did not flinch and did not run. She stood on the bank steps with a jar of poisoned water in one hand and 30 years of a dead man's truth in the other, and she looked Samuel Crow dead in the eye as his hand closed on the gun. "Go ahead," Clara said, quiet, steady, so only he could hear. "In front of all of them." That's the one thing that'd finish it faster than any land agent ever could. And Samuel Crow's hand, closed white-knuckled around the pistol grip, began very slightly to shake. For the space of 3 heartbeats, nobody in that street moved. Then Ethan Walker stepped between his wife and the gun. He did it slow, and he did it without a weapon in his hand, and he put his own body square in front of Clara so that the muzzle of Samuel Crow's pistol was pointed at his chest and nowhere near her. "You want to shoot somebody, Crow?" Ethan said, and his voice did not shake. "You shoot me, not her. She only read the truth. I'm the one who spent 2 months making sure the whole valley heard it." He took one step forward into the gun. "But you pull that trigger in front of 60 witnesses and a federal agent on the road, and every dream you ever had of owning this valley dies with the sound of it. You'll hang Samuel, not for the water, not for the note, for the murder of an unarmed man in the street. Is the water worth the rope? You do the arithmetic. You were always good at the arithmetic." Crow's eyes flicked from Ethan to the crowd to the gun in his own hand, and Ethan watched him do the sum, watched the cold cost of it land. And then a new voice cut across the whole street, hard and official and carrying. "Everybody hold where you are. Put the weapon down. Now." A man was riding up the street, on a lathered horse dust to his collar, and on his coat, catching the morning light, was the silver badge of a United States land agent. He'd ridden hard, and he'd ridden long, and he'd arrived by the grace of God and Clara's letter at the one moment that mattered most. "I said put it down," the agent repeated, swinging off his horse. "I've been on this road since before dawn, following a report of a fraudulent seizure of federal water claims, and I ride into town to find a man pointing a pistol at an unarmed couple in front of the whole county. Somebody had best start talking, and I'd advise it not be with a gun in his hand." For a long, terrible moment, Samuel Crow stood frozen on the bank steps. Then his hand opened, and the pistol clattered down the steps. And something in the man seemed to collapse inward, the way a barn collapses. Not all at once, but joint by joint, until there's nothing left standing but a pile of what used to be. "Thank God," Clara breathed, and only then did Ethan feel her hand grip the back of his coat, and only then did he understand how frightened she'd been standing there so calm. The land agent's name was Marshall Thomas Reed, and he was a spare, gray, unhurried man who had spent 20 years watching rich men try to steal from the government, and he was not impressed by fine coats. The first thing he did was turn to the local marshal, a heavy-set man named Pike, who'd stood at the edge of the crowd the whole time doing nothing, because Pike drew a quiet second wage from Crow, and everyone in the valley knew it. "You're the law here?" Reed asked. "I am," Pike said, puffing up. "Then you'll tell me why a man just pulled a pistol on an unarmed couple in your street, and you stood there with your thumbs in your belt." Pike's face went red. "Now see here, Mr. Crow's a respected—" "Mr. Crow's under arrest," Reed said flatly. "And a lawman who watches a rich man draw down on his neighbors and does nothing is a lawman. I'll be asking some hard questions of myself before I'm done in this valley. You'd best hope you come out of those questions cleaner than your friend. Now get out of my way and let a man do the job you wouldn't." And Pike, who had lorded over that valley for 11 years on Crow's coin, stepped back into the crowd with his face burning, and not one soul made room for him. And that was the end of Pike's authority in the Powder River country. It fell off him in the street like a coat, and everyone saw it fall. Reed set up in the back room of the bank, and he took testimony all afternoon, and the whole valley lined up to give it. Clara went first. She laid it all out plain: the debt Crow had bought in secret, the lie about the bank board, the pulled fences, the burned haze, the men on the road who'd been told the woman needn't come back, and the poisoned spring with the 3 dead calves. She had the papers for the debt. She had the sealed jar. She had a dead calf kept cold in the spring house that she'd carried down the mountain wrapped in oilcloth. Reed examined the water claims for a long time. Then he set them down and looked at her. "These are good, Mrs. Walker," he said. "Filed proper, recorded proper, never canceled. This water belongs to the Walker estate free and clear, and no foreclosure in the world touches it. You understood that from reading them yourself." "I did." "Where'd you study law?" "I didn't," Clara said. "I nursed 2 dying parents for 7 years, Mr. Reed, and in 7 years of sitting up nights, you learn to read anything careful. Papers aren't any harder than people once you slow down enough to hear what they're actually saying." Reed looked at her a moment longer. Then, for the first time all afternoon, he almost smiled. "No," he said, "I don't suppose they are." Voss broke next. The soft round banker had been sweating in the corner since noon, and when Reed called him, he came apart entirely dabbing and stammering, and he told the whole thing to save his own neck: how Crow had bought the note through him, how Crow had ordered the board lie, how Crow had leaned on him with debts of his own that Crow held. He swore up and down he'd known nothing about the fire or the poison or the men on the road, and Reed wrote it all down and let him believe that swearing would save him. But the thing that finished Samuel Crow wasn't the banker. It was one of his own men. Reed had sent word out for the 3 riders who'd worked Crow's night errands, and 2 had already run for the territory line. But the 3rd, a young one hardly more than a boy, got brought in by 2 ranchers who'd caught him trying to saddle up quiet behind the livery. And the boy took one look at the badge and the gray, unhurried face and the rope of his own future, and he started talking before Reed even asked. "I didn't poison no water," the boy said, shaking. "That was Crow hisself with his own hands 2 nights back. He wouldn't trust it to none of us. But the night on the road, the woman—" He couldn't look at Clara. "He told us. He said if we found her, we was to take the papers and see she didn't make it back up the mountain. Them was his words. I swear before God them was his exact words. I never done it. We never found her. But he said it. He said it to my face." The back room of the bank went dead silent. And Samuel Crow, who had bought half the debt in the valley, who had owned his banker and cowed his neighbors and laughed at a dead man for 30 years, sat in his fine coat and understood that it was his own hired boy, terrified and honest, who had put the rope around his neck. Marshal Reed closed his book. "Samuel Crow," he said, standing, "I'm placing you under arrest. Fraud in the seizure of federal claims, destruction of a federal water source, and solicitation to murder Clara Walker on the county road." He nodded to the 2 ranchers by the door. "There's a territorial court in the capital that's going to want a long conversation with you. You'll ride there with me tomorrow." Crow found his voice one last time. "You've got nothing. A boy's word, a jar of dirty water. My lawyers will—" "Your lawyers," Reed said, "cost money. And by the time the territory's done sorting out how much of what you own was got by fraud, I don't expect you'll have much of it left." He looked at Crow with something close to pity, and pity was worse than anything. "You had the finest herd in 3 counties, Mr. Crow. You had more than most men dream of. And it wasn't enough for you, and now it's gone, and you did it to yourself. Over 40 acres of water you were too proud to just ask a neighbor to share." He shook his head. "Take him." They took him. And the whole valley watched Samuel Crow walk out of that bank with his hands bound and his fine coat dusty, and his head, for the first time in his life, bowed, and not one soul in that street called out to help him, because he had spent his whole life making sure they wouldn't. But at the door, he stopped, and he turned, and he looked at Clara. And for a moment, the rage was gone, and there was only a kind of baffled, bitter wonder in his face. "I don't understand you," he said. "I offered your husband a fair way out 3 times over. I'd have made you both comfortable, and you threw it all in the fire to keep a dying ranch and a load of my trouble. Why, what in God's name was worth all this?" Clara looked at him a long moment. "You never once figured out the answer to that, did you?" she said quietly. "That's what beat you, Mr. Crow. Not the water, not the papers. It's that you spent your whole life believing everything has a price, and everybody can be bought. And you rode up that mountain sure a grieving man and a plain woman would fold for a comfortable escape." She shook her head almost gentle. "But some things aren't for sale. A man's father's name, a place where somebody finally mattered. You'd have understood that once, maybe before the money got to you. You just forgot, and forgetting it cost you everything you had." Samuel Crow stared at her, and whatever he'd meant to say, he didn't say it. He turned and let them lead him out, and he never once looked back, and the valley never saw him again. It should have been the end of it. Ethan thought it was. He stood in the emptying street with the sun going down, and his wife beside him, and the man who'd hunted them both, hauled off to answer for it, and for one clean moment, he let himself believe it was over. Then the marshal came back out, and his face had gone careful. "Mr. Walker, a word before I go." "Anything, Marshal. We owe you. You don't owe me a thing, but I owe you the truth." Reed set his hat back on. "Crow's arrested, and he'll likely hang or rot, and the water's yours free and clear. But that note—" He nodded back toward the bank. "The note's real, Mr. Walker. Crow got it by underhanded means, but the debt itself is honest. You borrowed the money, and it was owed. When the territory seizes Crow's estate for fraud, that note goes into it with everything else, and the court'll want it paid to you or to whoever's owed, same as any other debt. The foreclosure's void. Nobody's taking your ranch tomorrow. But that money's still owed, and come spring, some court clerk's going to come looking for it. I won't lie to you and say it's finished. It ain't." Ethan's face fell. "So we're saved from Crow, but not from the debt." "Not from the debt," Reed agreed. "I'm sorry. I wish I had cleaner news." He mounted up. "You've got till spring near as I can figure. That's more than you had this morning. Make it count." And he rode off after his prisoner into the dusk. Ethan stood there a long moment. "Half a year?" he said. "We fought all this we near died, and at the end of it, we've bought ourselves half a year and a debt we still can't pay." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't know whether to thank God or curse him." Clara took his arm. "Thank him," she said. "Because half a year ago you had 30 days and a thief holding the note. Now you've got 6 months and no thief at all. That's not nothing, Ethan. That's everything changing. We just have to be smart about what comes next." She turned him toward the horses. "And I already know what comes next. I've known since the drought started. Come on, we've got a valley to talk to before they all ride home." She didn't take him back up the mountain. She walked him instead to the middle of the street, where the ranchers still stood in knots, talking over the day they'd just witnessed. And she raised her voice one more time. "Neighbors, one more minute of your time, and then we'll all go home." They gathered. And it was a strange thing, Ethan thought, watching them. These were the same men who'd laughed at her 2 months ago, and now they came when she called and quieted when she spoke. "Most of you watered your stock on our mountain this week," Clara said. "Free, same as we promised, and that water saved a lot of herds that'd be carcasses by now. I'm glad of it. Ethan's father would be glad of it." She paused. "But this drought's not the last one. You all know that. The powder runs dry near every hard summer now, and it's going to keep running dry, and every year some of you are going to stand and watch your stock die of thirst while there's cold water sitting up on our mountain. That's not right, and it's not smart. So here's what we're going to do." She let that hang, and every man in the street leaned in. "We're going to build a proper water line," Clara said. "Off the springs down the mountain to a big trough on the low road where any man in this valley can water his herd in a dry year. Ethan and me will build it and keep it. And in exchange, each ranch that wants the right to that water in a drought pays a fair yearly share, small enough that any honest man can afford it, steady enough that it keeps the line built and the springs clean." Not one man ever again dies of a dry summer in this valley. And Black Hollow earns an honest living doing what that mountain was always meant to do. She looked around at them. Crow wanted to own the water so he could hold it over your heads. We want to share it so nobody ever gets held over a barrel again. That's the difference between him and us. That's the whole difference. Now who's in? For a moment nobody spoke. Then the old rancher who'd watered his 40 head that week stepped forward and took off his hat. "I'm in," he said. "God knows I'm in. And I'll say something else in front of everybody that I should have said a long time ago." He turned to face the crowd. "I laughed at this woman when she come. I laughed at her size, and I laughed at her name, and I called her a fool wife for a fool man. And this fool wife just saved my whole herd and offered to save it every year after. I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it. And any man here who laughed with me owes her the same words I'm saying now. I'm sorry, ma'am, and thank you." One by one, hats came off up and down that street. Clara Whitmore, who had been laughed at in that exact spot 2 months before, stood in the last light and watched the whole valley bare its head to her, and she found she couldn't say a word, because there was something in her throat that hadn't been there in 26 years, and she was not going to let 60 ranchers watch her weep over it. Ethan saw it. He put his hand on the small of her back, quiet, just for her. "Say something," he murmured. "They're waiting." Clara swallowed hard. "I'm in too," she managed. "Line goes up before next summer. Come by the ranch and we'll write down your shares proper." And then, because she had to say something that wasn't the enormous thing pressing up in her chest, she added, "And bring your own water barrels. I'm not lending out mine." They laughed a warm laugh this time, a valley's laugh, the kind that folds a person in instead of shutting them out, and the men put their hats back on and mounted up and rode home in the dusk, and more than one of them looked back at the big plain woman in the street and thought that they had witnessed something that day they'd be telling their grandchildren about. The water shares didn't just save the ranch, they did more than that. Word of the drought-proof springs and the drought-proof cattle spread out of the valley and into the territory, the way a good story always travels faster than a bad road. And before the month was out, a cattle buyer rode up the north road, a real buyer from the big markets down south, in a plain coat and a hard hat, who'd heard there was a mountain herd that came through the worst drought in 10 years, fat and shining. He walked Ethan's pasture for 2 days. He looked at the broad-chested calves and the deep-bodied cows, and the way not one of them had dropped weight in a killing summer. And at the end of it, he sat at Clara's kitchen table and named a price for breeding stock that made Ethan set his coffee down very carefully. "Say that again," Ethan said. The buyer said it again. "For the whole herd, for 30 head of your best breeding stock," the buyer said. "You keep the rest to build on. I've got ranchers all down the territory who'd give an arm for cattle that can winter hard and drought through August. Your father bred something nobody else has, Mr. Walker. That's worth real money to men who've spent a fortune burying stock that couldn't take the country." He tapped the table. "That price clears whatever you owe and starts you fresh. And I'll be back next year for 30 more if you've got them." "How'd you even hear of us?" Ethan asked. "We're 9 miles up a mountain nobody's heard of." The buyer smiled. "Mr. Half the Territory's heard of you by now. There's a story going around about a broke rancher and a mail-order wife who read a dead man's books and beat the richest man in the valley with nothing but a jar of dirty water and the United States government." He shook his head. "A story like that carries a long way. And when I heard the part about drought-proof cattle, I saddled up. Best stories usually have something true underneath the tall part." He looked around the kitchen at the ledgers stacked neat on the shelf. "Turns out this one's got more true under it than most." Ethan Walker looked across the table at Clara, and Clara looked back at him, and her eyes were bright, and she said quiet, 30 years, Ethan. Your father put in 30 years, and everyone called him a fool. And here's a man from the big markets sitting at his table offering real money for what the old man built. Take the deal. Take it and go pay off that note yourself in cash and watch the court clerk's face." They took the deal. They built the water line that same season before the first snow, and the whole valley turned out to help. That was the thing Clara never got over watching it. The same men who'd laughed hauling pipe up the mountain on their own backs, sinking posts, digging the trench down the low road with their own shovels, because it was their water now too, and a man works different for a thing that's partly his. Wives came with dinners. Children ran messages. The old rancher who'd first begged for water ran the whole crew like a foreman, hollering and pointing. And when a section of line finally reached the big new trough on the low road, and Ethan opened the spring box up top, the whole valley stood in the cold and watched cold, clean mountain water come running down out of 19 years of a dead man's foresight and fill that trough to the brim. Somebody cheered. Then all of them did. "He'd have liked this," Ethan said to Clara, quiet watching the water rise. "My father. He'd have stood right here and never said a word and just grinned like a fool all afternoon." "He is here," Clara said. "Every drop of that water is him. You're looking right at him." Ethan paid the note in full. That spring, rode into the Capitol himself, walked into the court that held Crow's seized estate, and laid the money down in front of a startled clerk, and paid off the debt that Samuel Crow had schemed a whole year to use against him. And when it was done, and the paper was stamped clear, Ethan Walker owned Black Hollow Ranch free and clear for the first time in his life. The land, the grass, the cattle, and the water. Every acre and every drop of it, his and no other man's. He rode home 2 days with the clear title against his heart, the same way Clara had ridden home with the water claims months before, and he came over the rise into the yard at dusk, and found her waiting for him, and he got down off the horse, and he did not say a word about the title. He said something else instead. "Clara." He stood in front of her with his hat in his hands, turning it the way he had the very first day. "There's a thing I've been trying to say for months, and I've been too much of a coward to say it, and I rode 2 days deciding I wasn't going to be a coward one more day." He drew a breath. "We got married on paper, a business arrangement. You came to milk cows, and I came to save a ranch, and we both said plain it wasn't about love." He looked up at her. "But somewhere between the ledgers and the drought and the night on that ridge, I stopped thinking of you as the woman who came to work my ranch. And I started thinking of you as—" his voice caught. "As the reason the ranch was worth saving at all." Clara stood very still. "I know we said it wasn't love," Ethan went on faster now before his nerve could fail. "I know you stopped believing in it. I know every man who ever looked at you made you feel like second best, and God forgive me, I made that same face the first day, and I have hated myself for it ever since. So I need you to hear this and know it's true, because I've never meant anything truer in my life." He took her hands. "You are not second to anyone, Clara Whitmore. Not to Sarah. Not to any pretty girl I ever knew. Not to anybody who ever lived. You are the first and the finest thing that ever walked up that road. And I don't want a wife on paper anymore. I want you. For real and for keeps and for every year I've got left. Will you have me, not the arrangement, me?" For a long moment Clara couldn't speak. 26 years she'd waited to hear a man say a thing like that, and she'd stopped believing she ever would, and she'd built a whole life around not needing it. And now here it was in the dusk in the yard of a ranch she'd hauled back from the grave with her own 2 hands from a man who'd wept in her arms and stood between her and a gun. "Ethan Walker," she said, and her voice was not steady at all now, and for once she let it not be. "I came here to be useful. That's all I ever asked of the world, just to be useful to somebody. I never once let myself ask to be loved. I didn't think it was a thing I was allowed to want." She pressed his hands hard between hers. "And you're standing there offering me the one thing I never let myself hope for, and I don't even know how to hold it because I've got no practice." "Then we'll learn together," Ethan said. "God knows I've got no practice either. 4 years I forgot how to do anything but grieve." "Yes," Clara said. "Yes. Yes, I'll have you, you fool. You beautiful, stubborn, grieving fool." And she was laughing and crying both at once now, which she had sworn she would never do in front of anybody. "Yes, for real and for keeps and for every year we've got. Yes." Ethan Walker dropped his hat in the dirt and took his wife in his arms in the yard of the ranch his father built and his father's father before him, in the last light of a day that had begun with a clear title and ended with a truth far more valuable than any deed. And down the mountain, the springs ran cold and clean toward a valley that no longer laughed. And up on the north ridge, the strong cattle of a vindicated old man grazed in the dark. And inside the sagging house that no longer sagged quite so much, the fire was lit and the table was set, and there was, for the first time in a very long time, more than one soul glad to be under the roof. They stood in the yard a long while, the two of them holding on. There was one more thing Ethan needed to do, and he did it the next morning, and he asked Clara to come with him. He led her up past the north ridge to a spot she'd never been, where a single wooden marker stood weathered gray in the grass. Sarah's grave. He hadn't been up to it in over a year. He'd told her once he couldn't bear it, that visiting felt like tearing the scab off something that never healed. He knelt down and pulled the tall grass back from the marker with his own hands. "I brought somebody to meet you, Sarah," he said low. "Her name's Clara. She came up that road last summer to milk cows, and she ended up saving the whole place, the ranch, the cattle, my father's name." He swallowed. "Me. She saved me, Sarah. I was down in a hole so deep after you went that I'd stopped trying to climb out. I'd made my peace with dying down there, and she reached in and hauled me up whether I wanted it or not." His voice broke. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it wherever you are. I loved you. I loved you every single day, even the days I was too busy drowning to say it. And I'm sorry you died thinking the ranch came first. It never did. You came first. You always came first. I just didn't know how to say it till it was too late." He pressed his hand flat against the cold ground. "But I'm saying it now. And I'm asking your leave to love again. Not instead of you. Alongside you. There's room in a man for both, I think. I hope there is. Because I'm going to try." Clara stood back and let him have it, the whole of it, and she did not say a word. And when Ethan finally stood up, his face was wet, but it was clearer than she'd ever seen it, like a window finally washed after 4 years of grime. "She'd have liked you," he said. "Sarah. She had no patience for foolishness either. She'd have looked at you and known right off you were worth 10 of the folks down in that town." "Then I'm sorry I never got to meet her," Clara said softly. "It sounds like she was worth 10 of them too." They walked back down the ridge together, and something had been set down up there that a man had carried 4 years too long, and the walking was easier for the both of them after. "Your father would be proud," Clara said finally, as the house came into view below. "Of the ranch. Of you," she said. "You climbed up out of the dark, Ethan, all the way up. You did the hardest thing a broken man can do. You let yourself hope again knowing it could cost you everything." She stopped and looked at him. That's the thing he'd be proudest of. Not the water. Not the cattle. You. And Ethan Walker, who 2 months before had made a disappointed face at a woman coming over a rise, held that same woman in the dusk and understood all the way to the bottom of himself that she had never once been the thing he'd hired. She had been the thing that saved him. They were married in truth 3 weeks later in the yard of the ranch, and the whole valley came. Clara had said she wanted no fuss. She'd been married on paper already, she said, and a second go-round with a preacher and a cake seemed like tempting fate. But Ethan wouldn't hear it, and neither would the valley. The women who'd once climbed the mountain to stare at her now climbed it carrying food, and this time they meant it. The old rancher who'd begged for water gave away the bride because Clara had no father left to do it, and he wept so hard doing it that he could barely get the words out. And Ida Merrick, the churchwoman whose welcome pie Clara had taken right out of her hands that first hard week, stood at the back of the crowd, and when it came time for anyone to speak, she stepped forward, red-faced, and said her piece. "I owe this woman an apology," Ida said, "and I'm going to give it in front of God and everybody, so I can't take it back. I came up this mountain last summer to look down my nose at her, and she saw right through me, and she was kind to me anyway, kinder than I deserved. I've thought about that pie all year." She wiped her eyes. "You're a better woman than I am, Clara Walker. I'm proud to stand at your wedding, and I hope you'll let me bake you a pie you actually want to eat." Clara, in the only good dress she owned, looked at the woman a long moment. "Ida Merrick," she said, "I'd be glad of that pie. Apple if you've got it. And I'll tell you plain, I never held it against you. A woman learns young who's cruel from meanness, and who's just cruel from being scared. You were the scared kind. Those come around given time." She smiled. "You came around." There wasn't a dry eye in the yard. The preacher said the words, and Ethan Walker took Clara Whitmore to be his wife, not on paper this time, not as an arrangement, but for true in front of the whole valley, that had once laughed and now stood weeping and glad. And when he kissed her, the men threw their hats in the air, and the women cheered, and somebody fired a pistol at the sky, and the sound of it rolled off the mountain and down into the valley like the whole country was ringing. There was one guest nobody had expected: Harlan Voss. The banker came up the mountain alone, at the very end, after the vows hat literally in his hands, and he stood at the edge of the yard, where the light didn't quite reach, like a man not sure he had any right to be there. Ethan saw him first and went stiff. But Clara put a hand on her husband's arm. "Let him come," she said. "A man who climbs a mountain to say a thing has usually got a thing worth hearing." Voss came forward, and he couldn't look either of them in the eye. "I know I've got no business here," he said. "I helped him. Crow. I lied for him up on this mountain to your faces. I've thought about it every day since." He turned his hat in his hands. "I testified against him in the end. Told the whole truth. It doesn't undo what I did, but I couldn't let your wedding go by without saying it to you plain. I'm sorry. I was a coward. He owned my debts, and I let him own the rest of me too. And you two stood up to him when I didn't have the spine to." He swallowed. "That's all. I'll go. Mr. Voss." Clara stopped him. "You did the right thing at the end when it counted, and it cost you something to do it. Crow's men ran. You stayed and told the truth. That took more courage than you give yourself credit for." She nodded toward the tables. "There's food. Stay and eat. Nobody on this mountain's going to turn a man away for finally finding his nerve." Voss looked at her like she'd handed him something he didn't know how to carry, and he stayed. And that was the day the last of the old cruelty went out of that valley, at a wedding over a plate of food, because a plain woman decided mercy was worth more than being right. That night, when the last wagon had rolled home and the fires had burned low, Ethan and Clara sat on the porch step of their own house, married and quiet and tired in the good way. "You know what the strangest part is?" Clara said. "A year ago I stood in that town down there, and 60 people laughed at me in the street. And today the same 60 people rode up a mountain to watch me get married and cried like babies doing it." She shook her head. "I don't understand people, Ethan. I truly don't." "I do," Ethan said. "They didn't change because you got prettier or thinner or richer. You never changed a thing about yourself. You just stayed exactly who you were until the whole valley finally caught up to it." He put his arm around her. "That's the only kind of respect worth having, Clara. The kind you get for being yourself, not for pretending to be something else. You never once pretended. Not for me, not for them, not for anybody. That's the rarest thing I ever saw in a person." Clara leaned into him, and for once in her life, she didn't have anything to say back. She just let herself be held. The letter came in the fall, near a year after she'd first walked up that road. It was addressed in a fine, familiar hand, and when Clara saw it, her whole body went still, because she knew that writing. It was her sister's. Her oldest sister, Margaret, the prettiest of the three, married off at 19, to a banker's son, the golden girl their mother had held up all those years as everything Clara would never be. Clara sat down at the kitchen table and opened it with hands that weren't quite steady, and she read it once, and then she read it again, and Ethan watched her face change. "What is it?" he asked. "Bad news." "Margaret," Clara said slowly. "My sister. The one Mother always—" She stopped. Her husband ran off. Took the money, took everything, left her with 2 children and a house the bank's taking back. She's got nowhere to go, nobody left to ask. Clara set the letter down. She heard I'd married. Somebody wrote her that Clara had married a rancher out west and was doing well for herself, and she's writing to ask—" Clara's voice caught. "She's writing to ask if she can come, if I'd take her in, her and the children." Ethan sat down across from her. The sister who watched Mother tell me no man would ever have me and never once said a word to stop her," Clara said. "The sister who got the wedding and the husband and the fine house while I got told to make my peace with dying alone. That sister." She looked at the letter a long time. "And now she's got nothing, and I've got a ranch and a husband and a valley that respects me, and she's writing to the ugly spinster sister with her hat in her hand." The kitchen went quiet. Ethan didn't say anything. He'd learned over a year when a thing was Clara's to work through and not his to solve. "I could say no," Clara said, finally quiet. "God knows I've got cause. I could write her back 3 lines telling her exactly what it feels like to be the one nobody wants, and let her chew on it the way I chewed on it for 26 years. She turned the letter over in her hands. "Part of me wants to. I'd be lying if I said different. There's a mean little part of me that's been waiting my whole life for the day one of them needed me instead of pitying me." "And the rest of you?" Ethan asked. Clara was quiet a long moment. Then she stood up and went to the shelf where the old man's ledgers sat, and she put her hand flat on them, the way she did when she needed to remember something true. "The rest of me remembers what it feels like to have nowhere to go," she said. "The rest of me remembers writing a letter of my own once to a stranger in Montana because it was the last hope I had left. And a broken man I'd never met wrote back and sent me the fare, and it saved my whole life." She turned around. "I won't be the kind of person who slams a door on somebody drowning just to prove I can. That's Crow. That's exactly who Crow was. Somebody laughs at you long enough, and you can turn into the thing that laughed, or you can turn into the thing you wished had shown up when you needed it." She picked up a pen. "I know which one I'd rather be." She wrote her sister that afternoon. She told Margaret to come, her and the children both, that there was room and work and food, that nobody in the Powder River Valley would ever look down on her, and that she'd be met at the stage. "You're a better woman than the whole lot of them put together," Ethan said, watching her seal it. "No," Clara said. "I'm just a woman who remembers. That's all mercy ever is, Ethan remembering when it was you." Margaret arrived before the first snow, thin and frightened and ashamed with 2 small children clinging to her skirts, and when she saw Clara step down to meet the stage, Clara hale and strong and standing tall, mistress of a mountain ranch with a good husband beside her. Margaret Whitmore burst into tears right there in the street. "I'm so sorry," she wept. "Clara, I'm so sorry. For all of it, for Mother, for never once standing up for you. I was young, and I was vain, and I let them treat you like you were nothing, and you were never nothing. You were the best of us. You were always the best of us, and I was too foolish to see it. Margaret." Clara took her sister by the shoulders. "Stop. Look at me. You're here now. You're safe. The children are safe. Whatever happened back east stays back east. Out here, nobody knows you as anything but my sister, and my sister is welcome, and that's the end of it." She pulled her in and held her. "We take care of our own on this mountain. You're our own now. Welcome home." And that was the whole of Clara's revenge in the end, to be to the sister who'd failed her the exact kind of person that sister had failed to be. It was a better revenge than cruelty. It let Clara sleep at night. Then the first winter came, and it came hard. The blizzard hit, in January, the worst storm the valley had seen in a generation, and it tested everything Clara and Ethan had built. The wind came down off the high country like something with teeth, and the snow piled to the eaves, and up and down the valley, men fought to keep their stock alive through cold that killed weak animals where they stood. And on the second night of it, Ethan didn't come home. He'd ridden out at noon to move the last of the herd into the shelter of the North Ridge the way his father's ledger said, and the storm had closed in behind him, and by dark he still wasn't back. Clara stood at the window, with her heart in her throat, and Margaret stood beside her, white-faced, and the children slept, and the wind screamed. "He knows this mountain," Margaret said, trying to believe it. He'll be all right. He knows every foot of it. He knows it in daylight, Clara said, not blind in a whiteout with the trails gone under 4 feet of snow. She was already pulling on her coat. I'm going after him. Clara, no, you'll die out there. Then I'll die going after my husband, which is a sight better than sitting here watching the window while he freezes. Clara wrapped a scarf around her face. Keep the fire high and the lamp in the window. If we come back, that lamp's how we'll find the house. Don't you let it go out, Margaret. Whatever happens, don't you let that lamp go out. She went out into the storm. The cold hit her like a wall, and the wind tried to take her off her feet, and within 20 steps, the house was gone behind her in the white. She kept her hand on the fence line and followed it post by post, out toward the north ridge, calling his name into a wind that tore the sound away the second it left her mouth. Ethan, Ethan. Nothing. Just the scream of the storm. She lost the fence at the corner, and for one heart-stopping moment, she stood turned around in the white with no house behind her and no ridge ahead, nothing in any direction but howling snow, and she understood exactly how men died 40 feet from their own doors in a storm like this. She forced the panic down. She thought about what the old man's ledger said, the herd shelters in the lee of the North Ridge, and she thought about where a man leading cattle would go, and she pushed on toward the ridge on faith alone. She found him a quarter-mile out. He was on foot, leading his horse that had gone lame in a snow-hidden hole, both of them near frozen Ethan's face, gray, and his words coming slow, the way they come slow on a man the cold is taking. Clara, he slurred, not sure she was real. You shouldn't be out here, go back. Shut up and lean on me, Clara said, getting her shoulder under his arm. We're going home, both of us, right now. Walk, Ethan. You walk if it kills you. Left foot. There, right foot, again. Leave the horse. I'm not leaving anything. Walk. She got her shoulder under his arm, and she half carried him, dragging the lame horse behind by the reins, and she followed the one light in all that howling dark, the lamp Margaret kept burning in the window, a single dim gold smear in the white, appearing and vanishing and appearing again as the wind tore the snow across it. Keep your eyes on the lamp, she told him over and over. Don't look at anything but the lamp. That's Margaret. That's home. That's warm. Walk toward it. Don't you dare stop walking toward it. Twice he went down. Twice she hauled him back up, this big, strong man gone limp as a child in the cold. And twice she put her face right down against his and said, You do not get to quit on me, Ethan Walker. I did not haul you up out of one grave to lose you to a snowbank. Now walk. And he walked because the one thing in the world he could still hear over the storm was her voice telling him to. She got him home through a storm that would have killed them both if she'd faltered even once. She didn't falter. Clara Whitmore had never once in her whole life been any good at stopping. They thawed him by the fire for hours, Margaret and Clara both rubbing life back into his hands and feet, and near midnight he finally came all the way back to himself, and the first thing he did was grab Clara's hand. You came out in that, he said hoarse. You came out into that storm after me. Of course I did, Clara said. What did you think I'd do, sit inside and knit? You could have died. So could you, so we're even. She pressed his hand to her cheek. You don't get to leave me, Ethan Walker. Not after all this. Not after I hauled you up out of the dark once already. I didn't do all that work just to lose you to a snowbank. Now drink your broth. When the storm broke 3 days later, and the men dug out and rode their fence lines counting the dead, the valley found that it had lost hundreds of head. Whole herds gone. It was a killing winter, the kind old men would measure other winters against for 50 years. But up on Black Hollow, in the shelter of the North Ridge, where a dead man's ledger had said to put them, Ethan Walker's cattle stood alive in the snow. Every one. Not a single head lost. The valley couldn't believe it. They rode up to see it with their own eyes, the drought-proof cattle that had now proved themselves winter-proof too, standing broad-chested and shaggy and alive, while half the valley's stock lay frozen. And they understood finally and completely what that stubborn old man had spent 30 years building, and what his son and his son's plain wife had brought back from the grave. 30 years. the old rancher said, standing in the snow, looking at the living herd. 30 years we called your daddy a fool, Ethan. And here's his cattle standing alive in the worst winter any of us ever seen while ours lie dead in the drifts. He took off his hat. I don't reckon anybody's going to be calling that man a fool ever again. Nor his boy, nor his boy's wife. That was the winter the legend truly began. Not the drought, but the drought and the blizzard. Both the same herd proving itself against the two things that killed cattle in that country. Heat and cold thirst and freeze. Word went out of the valley and into the territory and beyond it, and men who'd never set foot in Montana came to know the name Black Hollow and the name Walker, and the story of the mail-order bride who'd read a dead man's books and saved a dying ranch and beaten a rich man with the truth. But the greatest thing that winter brought had nothing to do with cattle at all. It was Clara who noticed first, and she said nothing for weeks because she didn't dare believe it. She was 27 years old. She'd been told her whole life she'd never marry, never have a family, never be anything but the sister who stayed home. She'd made her peace with it so long ago that hope in that direction was a muscle she'd let go soft from never using. But the signs kept on, and finally she couldn't deny them. And one evening in early spring she sat Ethan down at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her. "Ethan," she said, "I've got something to tell you, and I need you to sit down for it." His face went pale. "Is it bad? Are you sick, Clara?" "I'm not sick." She took a breath. "I'm going to have a baby." For a moment, Ethan Walker didn't move at all. Then he was up out of the chair and around the table, and he had her in his arms, and he was laughing and saying her name over and over, and Clara. Clara who never cried, who had trained herself for 27 years, never to cry in front of anybody, put her face in her husband's shoulder and wept like her heart was breaking open. Except it wasn't breaking. It was the opposite of breaking. It was a heart that had been closed so long it had forgotten it could open at all. "They told me I'd never have this," she wept. "My whole life. No husband, no children, nothing. Mother told me to make my peace with it. And I did, Ethan, I made my peace with it. I buried it so deep I forgot I ever wanted it." She pulled back and looked at him. "And now it's here. It's really here. I'm going to be somebody's mother. I didn't even let myself hope for it. I didn't dare." "You never dare hope for the big things," Ethan said, wiping her tears with his thumb. "You just go out and make them happen and act surprised when they do." The baby came hard at the end of summer in the same house where Ethan's father had kept his ledgers and Ethan's first wife had died. It was a long labor and a frightening one, and for a few hours in the dark, it went bad enough that Ethan stood outside the bedroom door with his fists clenched and prayed to a God he'd stopped talking to. When Sarah died, prayed harder than he'd ever prayed that he would not lose a second wife in that same room to the same dark. Margaret came out once in the worst of it, her face drawn, and Ethan grabbed her arm. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Is she—" "She's strong, Ethan. Stronger than any woman I ever saw." Margaret's voice shook. "But it's hard. It's very hard. Pray. Just pray." And she went back in. Ethan slid down the wall and sat on the floor with his back against the door, so that if the worst came, he'd at least be as close to her as a plank of wood would let him, and he listened to his wife fight for her life and their child's, and he made God every promise a desperate man makes. But Clara Whitmore had never once been any good at stopping. She came through it, and near dawn the cry of a healthy child rang out through the house, and the midwife opened the door and Ethan went in and found his wife exhausted and gray and radiant, holding a red squalling daughter against her chest. "A girl?" Clara whispered. "Ethan, we've got a girl." Ethan Walker knelt by the bed and looked at his wife and his daughter, and he could not speak for a while. "What do we call her?" he finally managed. Clara looked down at the baby. "I want to name her for your father," she said. "The man who left all those books. The man who saved this ranch 19 years before we ever knew we needed saving. What was his name, Ethan? You never once told me his given name." "Grace?" Ethan said softly. "My father's name was a man's name, but my mother was named Grace. He used to say she was the only thing he ever did right." His voice thickened. Grace Walker. I'd like that. I'd like that more than I can say. Then Grace it is. Clara touched the baby's cheek. Grace Walker. Born on the ranch her great-grandfather built, that her grandfather kept, that her father saved, that her mother. She stopped and smiled, tired and full. That her mother read back to life out of a stack of dusty books nobody else could be bothered to open. The years went on, the way years do. Grace grew up on that mountain, tall and strong and unafraid, and she was joined in time by a brother, and the two of them ran the same slopes. Where their father had once stood, bowed and broken. Except they never knew a broken father, only a straight-backed, laughing one who told them stories about their grandfather and taught them to read the old ledgers the way a family reads scripture. Clara taught Grace to read them herself when the girl was old enough, the two of them at the same kitchen table where it had all begun. Every one of these lines is a life, Clara would say, running her finger down the columns. A calf born a winter survived a choice a man made. Your great-grandfather wrote down 30 years so that somebody someday would know what he knew. Most folks threw books like these in the fire. We read ours. That's the whole difference between a family that lasts and one that doesn't. Grace, whether they bother to read what came before. And Grace, a girl who would never once in her life be told she was worthless, learned to read her family's history the way her mother had, slow and careful listening for what the pages were really saying. Margaret stayed. She never went back east. She married a valley rancher within 2 years, a good quiet man, and raised her children alongside Clara's, and the two sisters who'd been raised so far apart, the pretty one and the plain one, grew close in a way they never could have in the world that had ranked them against each other. Out on that mountain there was no ranking. There was only work and family and water enough for everyone. Samuel Crow was convicted in the territorial court that first winter on the boy's testimony, and Voss's, and the sealed jar of poisoned water, and he lost near everything he'd stolen and schemed for, and he died a few years later. A poor man in a rented room in the capital, and when word of it reached the valley, nobody rode up the mountain to tell Clara because nobody thought she'd care. And they were right, she didn't. She'd stopped thinking about Samuel Crow the day the storm proved her cattle. Men like that took up too much room in a person's head, and Clara had a ranch to run, and children to raise, and better things to fill her mind with. And Black Hollow Ranch became exactly what Clara had seen in it the first evening she came over that rise, with a suitcase in her hand, and disappointment on a stranger's face. The water line ran cold and clean down the mountain every summer, and no herd in the Powder River Valley ever died of thirst again. The cattle Ethan's father bred spread out across the territory and beyond, and men came from hundreds of miles to buy breeding stock, and every one of them heard somewhere along the way the story of how it had all near been lost, and how a mail-order bride nobody wanted had saved it. Travelers crossing the high country would stop in the valley and hear the tale from anyone who'd tell it, which was everyone. They'd hear about the ranch that came alive when everyone said it was dead. They'd hear about the stubborn old man vindicated from the grave. They'd hear about the broke, grieving cowboy who climbed up out of the dark. And they'd hear most of all about Clara Walker, the woman the whole valley had laughed at, the woman a rich man had hunted through the night, the woman who arrived with nothing but a suitcase, and the one thing nobody else in that whole country had thought to bring the patience to look at broken things and see what they were really worth. Clara grew old on that mountain. She grew old, strong, and respected, and surrounded the mistress of a legendary ranch grandmother to a whole clatter of children. The woman younger wives came to for advice, and younger men came to for a hard, honest word. And sometimes on a summer evening she'd sit on the porch of the house that no longer sagged at all and watch the cold water run down the mountain her husband's father had capped, and she'd think about the girl who'd stepped off that stage 20, 30, 40 years before and slapped a man who touched her and walked 9 miles up a mountain because a stranger hadn't come to collect her, and she'd shake her head at how close she'd come to never coming at all. Ethan would be beside her, gray now but straight-backed still, and he'd take her hand the way he had on that ridge the first frightened night, and neither of them would say much because after that many years, the best things don't need saying. But once near the end of it, an old and famous Clara was asked by a young reporter who'd ridden all the way from the east to write down the legend of Black Hollow Ranch. "Mrs. Walker, folks all say you saved this place. That you changed everything. How'd you do it? What was your secret? And Clara Walker, who had been called too big and too plain and too much her whole long life, who had been laughed at and hunted and underestimated by every soul who ever met her, until the day she made them all take off their hats, looked out over the mountain she'd hauled back from the grave, and she gave the young man the truest answer she had. "I didn't change a single thing," she said. "Not the ranch, not the cattle, not my husband, not myself. It was all already there, every bit of it just waiting in the dark for somebody to stop long enough to see it." She smiled. "The whole world's full of things folks have decided are worthless dying ranches, stubborn old men, plain women who don't fit what anybody pictured. And nearly every one of them is just waiting on the same thing. Somebody patient enough to look close and stubborn enough not to walk away." She stood up then, an old woman on the porch of a legend, and she looked out at the water running down the mountain, and she said the last of it plain, the way she'd said everything plain for a lifetime. "Nothing that's got life left in it is ever truly dead. Not a ranch, not a man, not a woman the whole world gave up on. And I am living proof of every word of it."